Hey there, night owls! Picture this. Around 1200 BCE, the most powerful civilizations on Earth, Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Babylon, didn't just stumble. They completely vanished. We're talking about empires that had stood for centuries, wiped out within a single human lifetime. Cities burned. Writing systems disappeared. Technologies that took generations to perfect were simply forgotten. It was like someone hit the reset button on human civilization, and historians have been scratching their heads about it for decades. So before we dive into one of history's most mind-blowing mysteries, do me a favour, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Seriously, I want to know what corner of the world is curious about ancient apocalypses at this hour. Now turn down those lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about the day the Bronze Age died, and why it might have been nature's most devastating plot twist. Ready? Let's go. Now, to really understand why this collapse was so catastrophic, we need to talk about what the Bronze Age actually was. And here's the thing. When most people imagine ancient civilizations, they picture isolated kingdoms doing their own thing, maybe occasionally bumping into each other during wars. That's not exactly wrong, but it's like describing the modern internet as people occasionally sending letters. The Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near East was way more connected than you'd think, and honestly, in some ways more globalized than Europe would be again until the Renaissance. Which, makes what happened around 1200 BCE even more impressive in the worst possible way. Let's set the scene. We're talking about the period roughly between 3300 and 1200 BCE, though the real action, the stuff that matters for our story, happens in what scholars call the Late Bronze Age, from about 1600 to 1200 BCE. This was the Golden Age, the peak, the moment when everything seemed to be going remarkably well for the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Egypt was thriving under the New Kingdom, building monuments that would make modern engineers weep with envy. The Hittite Empire controlled most of modern Turkey and parts of Syria, fielding armies that could go toe-to-toe with anyone. Mycenaean Greece was busy being the inspiration for every Greek myth you've ever heard. Yes, including the Trojan War, which probably actually happened around this time, though perhaps with fewer gods personally intervening on the battlefield. The Babylonians and Assyrians were doing their thing in Mesopotamia, building ziggurats and writing on clay tablets like it was going out of style. Which, spoiler alert, it kind of did. But here's what makes this period special. These civilizations weren't just existing near each other. They were talking to each other, trading with each other, marrying each other's princesses, and generally acting like the ancient equivalent of LinkedIn connections. We know this because archaeologists have found something absolutely remarkable. Diplomatic correspondence between these rulers. It's called the Amarna Letters, named after the site in Egypt where they were discovered, and reading them is kind of surreal because these ancient kings sound exactly like modern politicians, trying to maintain friendly relations while also definitely plotting against each other. You've got the Egyptian pharaoh writing to the Hittite king about marriage arrangements. You've got the king of Babylon complaining, and I mean really complaining, that the gold statues Egypt sent him were gold-plated rather than solid gold. Imagine getting a strongly worded diplomatic letter because your gift wasn't expensive enough. The king of Cyprus is writing about copper shipments. The king of Al-Ashir is sending condolences when someone dies and congratulations when someone takes the throne. These people were in constant communication, and not just, hey, nice weather we're having communication. We're talking detailed discussions about trade routes, military alliances, diplomatic marriages, and the occasional please send more gold request. It was, for all intents and purposes, an international community with its own rules, expectations, and a frankly impressive postal system for the Bronze Age. Now, why were they all so chatty? Simple bronze. Nobody calls the modern era the Silicon Age, though maybe they should. Anyway, bronze was the material that made civilization possible at this scale. You needed bronze for weapons, swords, spear points, arrowheads. You needed it for tools, axes, chisels, saw blades. You needed it for armor, for decorative objects, for religious items, for basically everything that required a material harder than copper, but more workable than iron, which they hadn't quite figured out yet. Bronze was, in modern terms, the equivalent of steel, plastic, and semiconductors all rolled into one. If you didn't have bronze, you didn't have a functioning civilization. Period. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Bronze isn't a naturally occurring metal. You can't just dig it up out of the ground and start making swords. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, usually in about a 90-10 ratio, though ancient metallurgists experimented with different proportions depending on what they were making. Swords needed to be harder, decorative objects could be softer, that sort of thing. Point is, you needed both copper and tin, and you needed them in significant quantities, and you needed people who knew how to melt them together at the right temperature without, poisoning themselves with metal fumes or burning down their entire workshop, which happened more often than you'd think. Now, copper wasn't too hard to find. Cyprus, whose name literally comes from the Greek word for copper, was the ancient world's copper superstore. The entire island was basically a giant copper mine, and the Cypriots made an absolute fortune shipping copper ingots all over the Mediterranean. These ingots, by the way, are one of the coolest archaeological finds from this period. They're shaped like stretched-out ox hides, weighing about 60 pounds each, and they've been found in shipwrecks all over the Mediterranean. Archaeologists call them oxhide ingots, which isn't the most creative name, but it's accurate. The Cypriots stamped them with marks indicating quality and origin, basically ancient branding, and ships would carry hundreds of them at a time. We know this because several Bronze Age shipwrecks have been found with their cargo still intact, lying on the sea floor like underwater time capsules, which is simultaneously fascinating and a stark reminder that maritime trade in the Bronze Age was definitely not covered by any kind of insurance policy. But tin? Tin was a problem. See, tin deposits are rare, really rare, and the Bronze Age Mediterranean didn't have any significant tin sources of its own. So where did they get it? Afghanistan? Seriously, the tin that made Bronze Age civilization possible was being mined in the mountains of Afghanistan and then transported, somehow, across thousands of miles of territory, through multiple kingdoms, probably changing hands dozens of times, until it finally reached the Mediterranean coast where it could be shipped to wherever it was needed. This wasn't just trade, this was a logistical miracle. There were other sources. Some tin came from what's now Britain, some from Central Asia, some from other scattered deposits. But the point is that tin had to come from far away, and that meant you needed functioning trade routes, stable kingdoms along those routes, and a whole lot of trust that your tin shipment wasn't going to get lost somewhere along the way. So you've got copper coming from Cyprus, tin coming from Afghanistan or beyond, and suddenly you realize that every single Bronze Age civilization was dependent on this incredibly complex, incredibly fragile supply chain. It's like if the entire modern world economy depended on getting one crucial component from a single remote location, and any disruption to the route would cause immediate economic chaos. Oh wait, that's basically what happened with semiconductor chips recently. Funny how history repeats itself, except in the Bronze Age they didn't have the option of just switching to a different supplier or increasing domestic production. If the tin stopped flowing, you stopped making bronze. If you stopped making bronze, you couldn't equip your army. If you couldn't equip your army, you couldn't defend your territory. If you couldn't defend your territory, well, you weren't going to be a civilization for much longer. And it wasn't just metals. The Bronze Age trade network carried everything. Cedar wood from Lebanon, prized for its quality and scent, was shipped to Egypt for temple construction and fancy furniture. Egypt, in return, exported grain, because the Nile floods made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world. Unfortunately for everyone else, Egypt knew this and wasn't shy about using food exports as diplomatic leverage. Pottery moved around the Mediterranean like ancient Tupperware, except it actually was quite valuable because different regions made different styles, and archaeological finds of foreign pottery tell us exactly who was trading with whom. Glass was being manufactured and traded. Yes, they had glass in the Bronze Age, and some of it was remarkably sophisticated. Textiles, dyes, perfumes, ivory, precious stones, exotic animals for royal zoos, and probably a fair amount of contraband that didn't make it into the official records. The archaeological site that really drives this home is the Uluburun shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey. This ship went down around 1300 BCE, right in the heart of the Late Bronze Age, and it was carrying what can only be described as a greatest hits collection of Bronze Age trade goods. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin ingots, probably from Afghanistan, glass ingots in multiple colours, ebony from Africa, ivory from elephants and hippos, jewellery, weapons, pottery from at least 7 different regions, a gold scarab with the name of Nefertiti on it. Yes, that Nefertiti. This single ship was carrying goods from all over the known world, worth an absolute fortune, representing trade connections that spanned from Britain to Afghanistan to the heart of Africa. And this wasn't unusual. This was just normal Bronze Age commerce, except this particular voyage ended badly for everyone involved. The people running this trade network weren't just merchants, though. Well, they were merchants, but they were also diplomats, translators, cultural ambassadors, and probably spies. These were people who could speak multiple languages, navigate the complex political situations of different kingdoms, and broker deals that satisfied everyone involved, or at least satisfied people enough that nobody started a war over it. Some of them were representatives of kings, carrying official correspondence and gifts between courts. Some were independent operators, making their fortune on the difference between what copper cost in Cyprus and what it sold for in Egypt. And some were probably what we'd call today grey market traders, dealing in goods that weren't strictly illegal, but weren't exactly going through official channels either. We even know some of their names. There was a merchant from Ugarit, a major port city in what's now Syria, named Sinaranu, who had business dealings across the eastern Mediterranean. His archives have survived, and they read like a Bronze Age version of business emails. He's confirming shipments, complaining about delayed deliveries, discussing prices, arranging credit, and generally dealing with all the headaches of international trade. Except instead of email, he's writing on clay tablets and sending them by ship, which meant if you had a time-sensitive business question, you might be waiting weeks or months for a response. Not exactly efficient by modern standards, but impressive for 1200 BCE. The language of international trade and diplomacy, by the way, was Akkadian, written in cuneiform script on clay tablets. This is fascinating because Akkadian was essentially a dead language by this point. It had been the language of the Babylonian Empire centuries earlier, but it hung on as the lingua franca of diplomacy and commerce, kind of like how Latin survived in European scholarship long after the Roman Empire fell, or how English functions in international business today despite being the native language of relatively few countries. Kings who spoke completely different languages in their own courts would correspond with each other in Akkadian. Trade contracts were written in Akkadian. If you wanted to operate in international circles during the Late Bronze Age, you needed to know Akkadian, which meant there was a whole class of scribes and translators making a living from their language skills. Some things never change. This interconnected world had some fascinating consequences. For one thing, it meant that cultural ideas spread rapidly. Artistic styles from Egypt show up in Mycenaean Greece. Hittite religious practices influence Canaanite temples. Everyone's copying everyone else's pottery designs, which actually makes dating archaeological finds easier because you can trace when certain styles were popular. Technology spread this way too. It's like an ancient arms race, except with horse-drawn vehicles instead of nuclear weapons. Diplomatic marriages were a huge part of this system too. This meant, imagine being an Egyptian princess married off to the Hittite court in central Anatolia. The climate's different, the food's different, the language is different, the religious practices are different, but you're expected to adjust and represent your home country's interests while also being loyal to your new husband's kingdom. And you're probably bringing with you a whole entourage of Egyptian servants, officials, and craftspeople who are equally confused by their new surroundings. No wonder the diplomatic letters are full of discussions about marriage arrangements. This was serious business with major political implications. But here's the thing about highly interconnected systems. They're efficient, but they're also fragile. The Bronze Age world had created a system where everyone depended on everyone else. Egypt needed copper and tin. Cyprus needed grain. The Hittites needed various resources they couldn't produce domestically. Babylon needed access to Mediterranean trade. Mycenaean Greece needed metals and luxury goods. Everyone needed everyone, and the system worked beautifully as long as everything kept working. It's like a house of cards built by master architects, impressive and stable, right up until something disturbs it. And there were warning signs that things weren't as stable as they seemed. Piracy was a constant problem. The Bronze Age equivalent of shipping insurance was basically hoping that your vessel had enough armed guards to fight off raiders. Some pirates were probably just criminals looking for easy loot, but others were operating with at least the tacit approval of various kingdoms. Privateers, essentially, attacking enemy shipping while leaving their own country's vessels alone. The line between legitimate naval forces and pirates was pretty blurry, which made international waters a somewhat exciting place to be if you were carrying a fortune in copper ingots. Wars disrupted trade routes regularly. When the Hittites and Egyptians went to war, which they did most famously at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, it wasn't just a military confrontation. It was an economic disaster for everyone involved, because trade routes got cut, merchants got caught in the crossfire, and suddenly the flow of crucial materials got interrupted. Eventually, after both sides fought to exhaustion and realized neither could really defeat the other, they signed a peace treaty. This treaty, by the way, is one of the oldest surviving international agreements, and you can see copies of it in the UN building in New York today, which is a nice touch. But the fact that they needed such a formal treaty tells you how important maintaining peaceful trade relations was. Climate in the Bronze Age wasn't static. It changed, sometimes dramatically, and those changes affected agriculture, which affected everything else. A few bad harvest years could destabilize a kingdom. A drought could cause famine, which could lead to social unrest, which could lead to political instability, which could lead to economic problems, which could disrupt trade, which could cause problems for other kingdoms. It was all connected, which was great for prosperity but terrible for resilience. And then there were the mysterious sea peoples, who we'll get to in more detail later, but who were already causing problems before the main collapse. These were groups of migrants, raiders, or refugees. Historians still argue about exactly what they were, who were moving around the eastern Mediterranean, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. They weren't a single unified force, but rather multiple different groups who got lumped together in Egyptian records. And they were a symptom of something larger going wrong in the Bronze Age world. People don't usually abandon their homes and take to the sea unless something's seriously wrong where they're from. The cities of the late Bronze Age reflected this interconnected prosperity. Ugarit, which I mentioned earlier, was basically the Dubai of its time, a cosmopolitan port city where merchants from a dozen different cultures rubbed shoulders, where multiple languages were spoken in the marketplaces, where luxury goods from across the known world were bought and sold. The city had a palace complex, multiple temples, residential districts with houses for wealthy merchants, warehouse districts for storing goods, and one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the ancient world. They had their own alphabet, actually one of the first alphabets ever invented, which was way more efficient than the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphic systems other cultures used. They were innovators, culturally sophisticated, economically successful, and absolutely convinced they'd continue being prosperous forever. Mycenaean Greece had massive palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and other sites. These weren't just royal residences, they were administrative centres that controlled surrounding agricultural territory, redistributed resources, organised craft production, and managed trade. The walls at Mycenae and Tiryns are called Cyclopean walls, because later Greeks couldn't believe humans had built them. They thought only the giant Cyclops could have moved stones that massive. These palaces had sophisticated plumbing, storage facilities that could hold provisions for thousands of people, workshops for producing goods, and writing systems for keeping detailed economic records. They were the nerve centres of complex organised societies that were doing remarkably well. The Hittite capital at Hattusa, in what's now central Turkey, was equally impressive. Multiple temples, massive fortifications, a palace complex, and archives full of clay tablets recording everything from military campaigns to religious festivals to trade agreements. The Hittites, they had diplomatic protocols. They had an organised military with different units serving different functions. They were by any measure a successful civilization at the peak of its power. Egypt? Well, Egypt was Egypt, building massive temples, carving giant statues, covering everything in hieroglyphs, and generally being the most continuously successful civilization of the ancient world. The New Kingdom period, which covers most of the Late Bronze Age, was when Egypt built most of its most famous monuments. Luxor Temple, Karnak Temple, the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel. These were projects that required enormous resources, sophisticated organisation, and the kind of confidence that comes from being a regional superpower. Egypt controlled territory from Nubia in the south to parts of Syria in the north, and pharaohs like Ramesses II weren't shy about advertising their power. Ramesses II, by the way, built so many statues of himself that archaeologists are still finding them. The man had no humility whatsoever, which from a historical perspective is actually helpful because it means we have tons of records from his reign. All of these civilizations had writing systems, which is crucial for our story. Mesopotamia had cuneiform. Mycenaean Greece had Linear B. The Hittites used a version of cuneiform adapted for their language. Ugarit had their alphabet. These weren't just decorative, they were functional writing systems used for keeping economic records, religious texts, historical accounts, diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, and literature. The fact that all these different writing systems existed and were in active use tells you these were sophisticated, literate societies with complex administrative needs. But literacy wasn't widespread. Writing was a specialized skill, and scribes, the people who could actually read and write, were valuable professionals. Becoming a scribe required years of training, learning hundreds or thousands of different signs or characters, practicing on clay tablets or papyrus until your hand cramped, and memorizing all the standard formulas and phrases used in official documents. But if you made it through that training, you were set for life. Scribes had job security, social status, and the kind of steady employment that most Bronze Age people could only dream about. Not exactly glamorous. You spent your days copying texts, writing letters, and recording grain inventories, but definitely better than being a farmer wondering if this year's harvest would be enough to survive on. The Bronze Age economy was what historians call a palace economy in most places. This meant the palace, meaning the king and his administration, controlled a lot of economic activity. They organised large-scale agriculture, collecting taxes in the form of grain and redistributing it to people who worked for the state. They organised craft production, employing specialists who made pottery, textiles, metalwork, and other goods. They managed trade, both importing necessary materials and exporting surplus goods. It was sort of like a command economy, but with more human sacrifice. I'm kidding mostly, and definitely more complicated than that simple description suggests. Ordinary people, they owed taxes or labour service to their rulers, but in return they got protection, access to the palace's redistributive system if harvest failed, and the benefits of living in a relatively stable, organised society. It wasn't exactly a democracy. The Bronze Age hadn't invented that yet, or rather they wouldn't for another few centuries, but it wasn't pure despotism either. Successful rulers had to maintain the loyalty of their subjects, which meant not taxing them into starvation and providing at least some level of security and justice. Religion was absolutely central to Bronze Age society, which shouldn't be surprising given that every ancient civilization was intensely religious by modern standards. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were economic institutions, owning land, employing hundreds of people and managing resources. Kings often claimed divine sanction for their rule. Some Egyptian pharaohs went further and claimed to literally be gods, which must have made diplomatic negotiations interesting. Religious festivals were major events involving massive sacrifices of animals, offerings of grain and luxury goods, processions, ritual performances, and probably a fair amount of feasting. These weren't just spiritual occasions, they were demonstrations of royal power and opportunities for redistribution of resources. And warfare, of course, was a constant feature of Bronze Age life, though not quite in the way Hollywood depicts it. Most wars weren't total conflicts aimed at completely destroying the enemy. They were usually limited campaigns with specific objectives, capturing a city, securing a trade route, enforcing the payment of tribute, or just demonstrating military superiority. Armies were relatively small by later standards, maybe a few thousand soldiers, and campaigns were seasonal because you needed your farmers to actually farm during planting and harvest times. Chariots were the prestige weapon, basically the tanks of their age, though infantry did most of the actual fighting. Sieges could last for years if the defenders had adequate supplies, which is why controlling agricultural land around cities was so strategically important. Now, I've spent all this time describing how connected and successful the Bronze Age world was, and you might be wondering why this matters for a story about civilizations collapsing. Here's why. The more interconnected and specialized a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to cascading failures. Every civilization had become dependent on resources they couldn't produce themselves. Every economy relied on trade routes that crossed multiple kingdoms. Every palace was supporting specialists, craftspeople, administrators, soldiers, priests, who didn't produce their own food and needed the agricultural surplus to survive. The whole system was incredibly efficient at generating prosperity, but it had virtually no redundancy. If one part of the system failed, it would immediately cause problems for every other part. Think about modern supply chains. When a single container ship blocked the Suez Canal in 2021, it disrupted global trade for weeks, causing shortages and price increases worldwide. That's one ship in one canal for a few days, and it affected the entire planet's economy. Now imagine that level of disruption, but in a world where ships took weeks to cross the Mediterranean, where there were no alternative suppliers or backup routes, where any major disruption would take months or years to sort out, and where the margins for survival were much thinner because they couldn't just order extra supplies from overseas if things got tight. That was the Bronze Age world, prosperous, sophisticated, interconnected, and sitting on a knife's edge without really realizing it. The palace economies, for all their sophistication, were also inherently rigid. They worked great when conditions were stable, when harvests were good, when trade routes were open, when neighbouring kingdoms were at peace, or at least engaged in manageable conflicts. But they weren't designed to handle multiple simultaneous crises. There was no emergency fund, no strategic reserve beyond maybe a few years of stored grain, no plan B if the entire system started falling apart. Success had made them complacent, and the very interconnectedness that had brought prosperity was about to become their downfall. Because here's what nobody in 1250 BCE realized. They were living at the peak of Bronze Age civilization, and they had maybe 50 years before everything would come crashing down. The great kingdoms, the sophisticated trade networks, the literate administrations, the massive building projects, all of it was about to disappear, not over centuries of gradual decline, but within a single lifetime. And when it fell, it would fall hard enough that some regions wouldn't recover for centuries, and when they did, they'd be building on the ruins of a lost world whose sophistication they couldn't even imagine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we can understand why and how it all collapsed, we need to look at the evidence, the actual historical and archaeological records that tell us what happened. And for that, we need to travel to Egypt and look at some temple walls where an ancient pharaoh decided to brag about his victories. Little did he know he was documenting one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. But that's a story for the next part of our journey. For now, just remember this. The Bronze Age world was connected, prosperous, sophisticated, and completely unprepared for what was about to hit it. They'd built, and when the storm came, and oh, it was coming, that sand was going to shift in ways nobody saw coming. So now that we've established how interconnected and prosperous the Bronze Age world was, we need to talk about the evidence for its collapse. And fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, we have a pretty detailed eyewitness account from someone who was right there when it all went down. His name was Ramesses III. He was the pharaoh of Egypt from roughly 1186 to 1155 BCE. And he had the good sense, or perhaps the enormous ego, to have his version of events carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Upper Egypt. And thank goodness he did, because without these inscriptions we'd be working mostly blind trying to figure out what happened during the Bronze Age collapse. Now, before we dive into what Ramesses III actually recorded, we need to understand something about ancient Egyptian royal inscriptions. They weren't exactly objective historical documents in the modern sense. When a pharaoh commissioned inscriptions for his temple walls, he wasn't thinking about providing accurate information for future historians. He was advertising his achievements to the gods and to his people. It was propaganda, essentially, but propaganda based on real events, which means we have to read it carefully, separate the boasting from the facts, and cross-reference it with other evidence when possible. It's like if every modern politician's memoir was our only source for contemporary history, you'd get some truth, but you'd have to filter out a lot of self-congratulation to find it. The outer walls depict military victories. The inner walls show religious ceremonies. And crucially for our purposes, there's a detailed account of what the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, groups of foreign invaders who threatened Egypt during Ramesses III's reign. The inscriptions are in hieroglyphs, naturally accompanied by carved reliefs showing battles, prisoners, and naval combat. It's like an ancient graphic novel, except carved in stone and intended to last for eternity, which, given that we're still reading it over 3,000 years later, worked out pretty well. The text describes a catastrophe that happened in the 8th year of Ramesses III's reign, around 1177 BCE. And I'm going to paraphrase here because ancient Egyptian royal inscriptions are very flowery and repetitive. They like to really drive home their points. But the basic message is this. A coalition of foreign peoples was moving through the Near East, destroying everything in their path. Cities were being burned. Kingdoms were falling. And these invaders were heading toward Egypt. Here's one of the more famous passages translated from the hieroglyphs. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Azawa, and Alashia were cut off at one time. Now, if you're not familiar with Bronze Age geography, let me translate that into modern terms. Hatti is the Hittite Empire, which controlled most of modern Turkey. Kode is part of Syria. Carchemish is a major city in northern Syria. Azawa is in western Turkey. Alashia is Cyprus. These weren't minor territories. These were major powers and important centres of Bronze Age civilization. And they were coming forward toward Egypt while the flame was prepared before them. This is not good news. These mysterious invaders had swept through the Near East, destroyed multiple civilizations, and were now threatening Egypt itself. And the Egyptian description makes them sound almost unstoppable. like a force of nature rather than a human army. But who were these people? Ramesses III helpfully provides a list of names: the Peliset, the Chika, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, among others. Historians collectively call them the Sea Peoples, though that's a modern term. The Egyptians never used it. They just listed the individual group names and described them as coming from the islands and the midst of the sea, which could mean they were seafaring peoples or island peoples, or maybe just that they arrived by sea. The Egyptian language wasn't always precise about these things, which is frustrating for modern historians, but probably made perfect sense to ancient Egyptians. Now here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean complicated. For about a century after these inscriptions were first studied in the late 1800s, scholars assumed the Sea Peoples were the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. It seemed straightforward enough. Mysterious invaders show up, destroy civilizations, and boom, collapse explained. Victorian archaeologists love this interpretation because it fit nicely with their ideas about barbarian invasions bringing down civilized empires, which was a framework they were already using to understand the fall of Rome. It was a simple, dramatic explanation. Civilization falls because of invasion by less civilized peoples. Case closed, let's move on. Except it's not that simple. It's never that simple, but especially not in this case. Modern archaeology and historical analysis have poked so many holes in the barbarian invasion theory that it basically doesn't hold water anymore, though you'll still see it in older books, and unfortunately in some popular history that hasn't caught up with the research. The problem is that this interpretation raises more questions than it answers, and when you start looking closely at the evidence, the whole neat narrative falls apart. First problem, timing. The Bronze Age collapse didn't happen all at once. Different regions collapsed at different times over a period of roughly 50 years, from about 1200 to 1150 BCE. Some places, like certain Mycenaean palaces, show evidence of gradual decline followed by abandonment. Some places survived but were severely weakened. If the Sea Peoples were this unified, coordinated military force sweeping through the region, you'd expect to see a more uniform pattern of destruction happening within a short time frame. Instead, the collapse looks more like a cascading failure over several decades. Second problem, the Sea Peoples themselves. Who were they really? The Egyptian inscriptions list multiple different groups with different names, which suggests they weren't a unified force but rather a loose coalition of different peoples. Some of them might have been refugees displaced by earlier disruptions. Some might have been opportunistic raiders taking advantage of the chaos. Some might have been mercenaries hired by one kingdom to fight against another, who then went rogue when their employers couldn't pay them anymore. The Egyptians weren't particularly interested in understanding the complex ethnic and political backgrounds of the people attacking them. From their perspective, they were all just foreign invaders threatening Egypt, so they got lumped together in the inscriptions. We can actually identify some of these groups based on their names. The Peliset are almost certainly the Philistines, who later settled in the southern Levant. The place name Palestine derives from Philistine. They show up in the Hebrew Bible as the enemies of the Israelites, and archaeology has found their settlements along the coast of what's now Israel and Gaza. Their pottery is distinctive and shows clear connections to Mycenaean Greek styles, which suggests they or their ancestors came from the Aegean region. So the Peliset Philistines were probably displaced Mycenaean Greeks, or people culturally connected to that area, fleeing the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization and looking for somewhere new to settle. They weren't barbarians, they were refugees from a collapsed civilization. The Shurden are another interesting case. They show up in Egyptian records decades before the reign of Ramesses III, and some of them were actually working as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Ramesses II, that's Ramesses III's grandfather, employed Shurden troops in his military campaigns. So these invaders were sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, depending on the political situation. That doesn't fit the simple barbarian invasion narrative at all. It suggests a much more complex situation where groups of people were moving around the Mediterranean looking for employment, land, or just survival, and sometimes that put them in conflict with existing kingdoms. The Ekwesh might be connected to the Achaeans, another name for the Mycenaean Greeks. The Tresh might be related to the Tyrrhenians, who later lived in Italy. These identifications are tentative and disputed. Ancient names don't always map neatly onto modern ethnic categories, but the pattern is clear. These Sea Peoples were coming from areas that were themselves experiencing the Bronze Age collapse. They weren't causing the collapse, they were symptoms of it. Third problem, the Egyptian inscriptions themselves contradict the barbarian invasion theory if you read them carefully. Yes, Ramesses III describes fighting off the Sea Peoples, but he also describes Egyptian victories, capturing prisoners and successfully defending Egypt's borders. In other words, Egypt survived the attacks. If the Sea Peoples were powerful enough to destroy the Hittite Empire and multiple other major civilizations, how did Egypt, which was just one kingdom, albeit a powerful one, manage to defeat them? The answer is probably that the Sea Peoples weren't this overwhelmingly powerful military force. They were a serious threat, yes, but one that a well-organized kingdom with a functioning army could handle. And here's the thing, Egypt didn't come through this period unscathed. Yes, they survived, unlike the Hittites and Mycenaeans, but Egypt was seriously weakened. The new kingdom, which had been the golden age of Egyptian power, was ending. Within a few generations, Egypt would split into smaller kingdoms and spend centuries being much less powerful than it had been during the Bronze Age. So even the civilization that successfully fought off the invaders still suffered catastrophic damage to their economy and political system. That tells us something important. The Sea Peoples weren't the fundamental cause of the collapse. They were part of a larger catastrophe that was affecting everyone, including both the invaders and the invaded. The relief carvings at Medinet Habu showing the battles against the Sea Peoples are actually fascinating from an artistic and historical perspective. They show naval battles, one of the earliest depictions of ship-to-ship combat in history. The Egyptian ships are fighting vessels that are described as coming from the midst of the sea. You can see soldiers fighting on the decks, ships ramming each other, people falling into the water. It's vivid, dramatic, and definitely designed to make Ramesses III look heroic. There are also scenes of land battles, showing Egyptian chariots and infantry fighting foreign warriors. The foreign soldiers are depicted wearing distinctive headgear. Some have feathered headdresses, some have horned helmets, which helps archaeologists identify which group is which. The prisoners are shown in typical Egyptian fashion, bound, defeated, often being presented to the pharaoh. Some are being counted. The Egyptians kept careful track of how many enemies they captured or killed, sometimes in rather gruesome ways. There are inscriptions listing the numbers, so many prisoners from the Peliset, so many from the Chika, and so on. Whether these numbers are accurate is debatable. Ancient kings weren't above inflating their victories, but they at least give us a sense of scale. We're talking about thousands of prisoners, not hundreds of thousands. These were serious military encounters, but not necessarily the apocalyptic battles the inscriptions make them sound like. Now, the Victorian archaeologists who first studied these inscriptions in detail were working with limited information and a particular worldview. They were studying ancient civilizations during the heyday of European imperialism, and they tended to see history through the lens of civilized empires being threatened by barbarian invasions. The fall of Rome was their template for understanding civilizational collapse. So when they found evidence of mysterious invaders attacking Bronze Age civilizations, they naturally assumed it was a similar situation. It was a neat narrative that fit their preconceptions. But this interpretation had some uncomfortable implications that even the Victorian scholars recognized. If Bronze Age civilizations, which were by any measure highly sophisticated, could be completely destroyed by external invasion, that suggested civilization was fragile, vulnerable, always at risk from outside forces. This made the imperial powers of the 1800s and early 1900s nervous because they were worried about the same thing happening to them. So there was actually a political and cultural subtext to the academic debate about the Sea Peoples. If great civilizations could be destroyed by barbarian invasion, what did that mean for European civilization? Modern archaeology has completely transformed our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse by using methods and evidence that weren't available to Victorian scholars. We can now date destruction layers much more precisely using scientific techniques. We can analyze pollen to understand ancient climate and agriculture. We can study skeletal remains to understand diet and health. We can examine trade goods to map economic networks. And when you put all this evidence together, you get a much more complex picture than barbarians invaded and destroyed everything. What we see is that different sites were destroyed or abandoned at different times. We see evidence of economic disruption and declining trade before the major destructions. We see signs of climate change and agricultural stress. We see internal rebellions and social unrest. We see evidence that some of the Sea Peoples were actually refugees from collapsed civilizations, not the cause of those collapses. The picture that emerges is of a systemic crisis, multiple factors all hitting at roughly the same time, creating a cascade of failures that brought down the interconnected Bronze Age world. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu tell us that Ramesses III faced serious external threats and managed to defeat them, at least militarily. But they don't tell us why those threats were happening in the first place. They don't explain why the Hittite Empire, which had been Egypt's rival superpower, completely disappeared. They don't explain why Mycenaean Greece collapsed into a dark age. They don't explain why trade networks broke down. They don't explain why writing systems were abandoned in some regions. The Sea Peoples are described as a symptom, groups of displaced people moving through the region, but the inscriptions don't address the underlying disease. And that's the crucial point that took historians about a century to fully appreciate. The Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were part of the collapse. They were people whose own societies were falling apart, who were displaced by drought or famine or political instability, who were moving as refugees or raiders through a region that was already under severe stress. When they attacked civilizations like Egypt, they were delivering the coup de grace to systems that were already failing for other reasons. Think about it this way. If your house is structurally sound, a group of people showing up at your door isn't going to make it collapse. But if your house has termite damage, foundation problems, and a leaky roof, then yeah, a little extra stress might be enough to bring the whole thing down. The Bronze Age civilizations were like that house. They looked solid from the outside, but they had underlying structural problems that made them vulnerable when external stress was applied. The Medinet Habu inscriptions are valuable because they give us a contemporary account of the chaos at the end of the Bronze Age. Rameses III witnessed civilizations falling, saw displaced peoples moving through the region, fought battles to defend Egypt's borders, and had all of it recorded for posterity. His perspective is inherently limited. He's an Egyptian pharaoh, not a neutral observer, but it's still incredibly valuable evidence. We just have to be careful not to take his interpretation of events as the complete explanation. There's also something poignant about these inscriptions when you think about them. Rameses III was probably the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He successfully defended Egypt and maintained its power during his reign, but he couldn't stop the long-term decline that was already underway. After his death, Egypt would face more invasions, internal strife, and eventually would split into smaller kingdoms. The temple at Medinet Habu, which he built to commemorate his victories and ensure his eternal glory, ended up being a monument to the end of an era. He thought he was preserving Egyptian greatness for eternity, but he was actually documenting the sunset of the Bronze Age. The relief carvings show such confidence: Egyptian soldiers triumphant, enemies defeated, order restored. The inscriptions describe Rameses III as the defender of Egypt, the strong arm that pushed back chaos. And in a sense he was. He did defend Egypt successfully, but he was defending against symptoms while the underlying crisis continued to worsen. It's like being the captain of a ship who successfully fights off pirates while not noticing that the ship is slowly sinking due to a leak below the waterline. You can win every battle and still lose the war. For decades after Medinet Habu was excavated and the inscriptions were translated, the Sea Peoples dominated scholarly discussion about the Bronze Age collapse. There were conferences about them, books about them, heated academic debates about their origins and their role in the collapse. Archaeologists excavated sites looking for evidence of Sea Peoples' destructions. Linguists analysed their names trying to figure out their ethnic identities. Historians developed elaborate theories about their migrations and military tactics. The Sea Peoples became, in some ways, more famous than the civilizations they supposedly destroyed. But gradually, as more evidence accumulated and analytical methods improved, scholars started to realize that focusing so much on the Sea Peoples was causing them to miss the bigger picture. Yes, there were groups of displaced people moving through the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Yes, some of them were violent raiders. Yes, they contributed to the destabilization of the region. But they weren't the fundamental cause of the collapse. They were one factor among many, and probably not even the most important factor. This realization was actually quite revolutionary in the field of Bronze Age studies, because it meant scholars had to completely rethink their approach. Instead of looking for a single dramatic cause, a barbarian invasion that destroyed everything, they had to consider multiple factors interacting in complex ways. This required bringing in evidence from different disciplines: climatology, geology, agricultural science, economics, sociology. It meant looking at environmental factors, social structures, economic systems, and how they all connected to create vulnerability or resilience. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu remain important primary sources, but now we read them differently. Instead of seeing them as proof that the Sea Peoples caused the collapse, we see them as evidence that the collapse was creating chaos, displacement, and violence across the region. Instead of focusing narrowly on the military encounters described in the text, we ask broader questions about why these encounters were happening in the first place. Instead of taking Ramesses III's perspective as the only perspective, we try to imagine what the situation looked like from other viewpoints, from the perspective of the refugees, from the perspective of the collapsing civilizations, from the perspective of ordinary people trying to survive during a time of catastrophic change. And when you start asking those broader questions, you realize that the evidence has been there all along, carved into temple walls and buried in archaeological sites across the eastern Mediterranean. It's just that scholars were so focused on the dramatic military narrative, invaders, battles, destruction, that they missed the more subtle signs of what was really going wrong. Climate was changing, agriculture was failing, trade networks were breaking down, social systems were under stress, and all of these factors were interconnected, creating a perfect storm of catastrophe that would reshape the ancient world. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe a world in chaos, with lands being removed and scattered in the fray. That's actually a remarkably apt description of what was happening, even if Ramesses III didn't fully understand the causes. The Bronze Age world was indeed being scattered, not just by military invasion, but by environmental crisis, economic collapse, and social disintegration. Cities were being abandoned, peoples were migrating, trade routes were failing, and entire civilizations were disappearing. The Sea Peoples were part of that chaos, not its origin. So when we read those ancient hieroglyphs today, we should be thinking about them as one piece of a much larger puzzle. They tell us that there were violent conflicts, displaced populations, and military crises around 1177 BCE. But they don't tell us about the droughts that were devastating agriculture. They don't tell us about the economic stress from disrupted trade networks. They don't tell us about the internal rebellions and social unrest that were weakening kingdoms from within. They don't tell us about the climate changes that were making the entire system unsustainable. He carved his victories into stone walls, hoping to achieve eternal glory and demonstrate his power to gods and humans alike. He succeeded in creating a lasting record, but it turned out to be a record of something much bigger and more tragic than he realized. He thought he was documenting his triumph over foreign invaders. He was actually documenting the death throes of Bronze Age civilization. And that's why the Victorian interpretation was wrong. It wasn't that they misread the inscriptions. The text clearly describes military conflicts with foreign peoples. They misunderstood what those conflicts meant in the larger historical context. They saw the Sea Peoples as the cause when they were really just the most visible symptom. They focused on the dramatic narrative of invasion and battle when the real story was slower, less visible, but ultimately more devastating. A systemic failure of interconnected civilizations that had become too fragile to survive when everything started going wrong at once. The irony is that Ramesses III probably thought he'd saved Egyptian civilization. His inscriptions certainly present him that way, the mighty pharaoh who defeated chaos and preserved order. And in the short term he did. Egypt survived when other civilizations didn't. But in the long term, the forces that were destroying the Bronze Age world would weaken Egypt too. His temple at Medinet Habu stands today as a magnificent monument, but also as a reminder that even the mightiest pharaohs couldn't hold back the tide of history when multiple catastrophes converged at once. So that's the evidence from Egypt, and that's why historians spent so long barking up the wrong tree with the Sea Peoples theory. It seemed like such a clear explanation, right there on the temple walls described by someone who was actually there. But history is rarely that simple, and the collapse of Bronze Age civilization definitely wasn't. The Sea Peoples were real, the conflicts were real, the chaos was real, but they were the final act of a tragedy that had already been unfolding for decades, caused by forces that ancient scribes didn't understand and modern historians are only now beginning to piece together. Which brings us to the next question. If the Sea Peoples didn't cause the Bronze Age collapse, what did? To answer that, we need to leave the temple walls of Egypt and dive into some cutting-edge science that's completely revolutionized our understanding of ancient history. We're going to talk about mud cores, pollen analysis, stalactites, and how modern researchers have learned to read the climate records hidden in the natural world. Because it turns out the biggest threat to Bronze Age civilization wasn't carried on ships or wielded by warriors, it was invisible, inescapable, and absolutely devastating. So here's where our story takes a turn that would have seemed like science fiction to those Victorian archaeologists we talked about earlier. Because while they were studying temple inscriptions and trying to figure out history from ancient texts and pottery shards, modern researchers have developed methods that would absolutely blow their minds. We're talking about reading history from sources that don't involve any writing at all: mud, pollen grains, cave formations, and microscopic sea creatures. It's the kind of interdisciplinary approach that brings together archaeology, geology, climatology, chemistry, and about half a dozen other scientific fields, all working together to answer the question, what actually happened around 1200 BCE? This scientific revolution in understanding the past really kicked off in the latter half of the 20th century, though it's accelerated dramatically in the last few decades. What changed was that scientists realized you could extract historical information from the natural environment itself. The Earth keeps records, it turns out, remarkably detailed records if you know where to look and how to read them. And these records don't care about royal propaganda or political spin. They just tell you what the conditions were like year by year, sometimes season by season, going back thousands of years. Let's start with one of the simplest but most powerful techniques, pollen analysis, or palynology if you want to use the fancy scientific term. Here's how it works. Plants produce pollen, and different plants produce distinctively different pollen grains that can be identified under a microscope. This pollen gets carried by wind or insects, and some of it ends up settling into lakes, bogs, or ocean sediments where it gets buried and preserved. Over time, you get layers of sediment with pollen trapped in them, creating a chronological record of what plants were growing in the area at different times in the past. Now, why does this matter for understanding ancient civilizations? Because different plants thrive in different conditions. If you're seeing lots of oak and beech pollen, you're looking at a period with plenty of rainfall and moderate temperatures. If you're seeing more drought-resistant plants like certain types of grasses or Mediterranean scrub vegetation, you know conditions were drier. If you see cultivated plant pollen like wheat or barley, you know people were actively farming in the area. And if agricultural pollen suddenly disappears and gets replaced by wild plant pollen, you know farming stopped, which usually means the human population declined or abandoned the area entirely. So scientists can drill into lake beds or coastal sediments, extract core samples that contain these layers of pollen-rich sediment, and then painstakingly count and identify pollen grains from different depths. It's exactly as tedious as it sounds. Imagine spending hours looking through a microscope, counting tiny grains and identifying which plant species each one came from, doing this for hundreds or thousands of samples. Not exactly thrilling work, though I suppose it beats digging in the hot sun, and you get to stay in a climate-controlled lab. The payoff for all this tedious counting is that you get a detailed picture of environmental conditions and agricultural activity going back centuries or millennia. When researchers started doing this kind of analysis on sites around the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, they found something remarkable. There's a clear signal of environmental change and agricultural decline starting around 1200 BCE, right when the Bronze Age collapse happened. The pollen record shows a shift toward drought-resistant vegetation, a decline in cultivated plant pollen, and an increase in wild plants that typically colonize abandoned agricultural land. In other words, the natural environment was recording the collapse of farming communities and the return of abandoned farmland to wilderness. Then there's the study of sediment cores from lakes and seas, which tells us about rainfall and erosion patterns. When you have lots of rainfall, water runoff from the land carries sediments into lakes and the ocean. The amount and type of sediment can tell you how much rain was falling and how much vegetation was present to hold soil in place. During dry periods, you get less sediment deposition, and the sediment you do get has a different chemical composition. By analysing sediment cores, scientists can reconstruct rainfall patterns going back thousands of years with remarkable precision. One of the most important sites for this research is the Dead Sea, which sits in a deep rift valley between modern Israel and Jordan. Because it's a closed basin, water flows in but doesn't flow out, the sediment record is particularly clear and undisturbed. Scientists have drilled cores from the Dead Sea floor and analysed them to reconstruct the history of rainfall and climate in the region. And what they found is striking. There's clear evidence of severe drought conditions starting right around 1200 BCE and lasting for decades. The Dead Sea sediment cores show increased salinity and reduced sediment deposition during this period, which indicates that rainfall was significantly below normal. The lake level dropped substantially. We're talking about many feet of water level decline, which in a lake the size of the Dead Sea represents an enormous amount of water that just wasn't falling as rain anymore. This wasn't a single bad year or even a decade of poor rainfall. This was a sustained climatic shift that fundamentally changed the environmental conditions across the entire region. Similar evidence comes from the Sea of Galilee, further north in the Jordan Valley. Sediment cores there show the same pattern, a dramatic shift toward drier conditions right around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. The sediment contains less organic material from aquatic plants, suggesting lower water levels and less productive lake ecosystems. Chemical analysis of the sediments confirms reduced rainfall. Multiple independent lines of evidence from different sites all pointing to the same conclusion. Something serious happened to the climate around 1200 BCE. But my favourite source of climate data, and this is where things get really cool, both figuratively and literally, comes from caves. Specifically from stalagmites and stalactites, those mineral formations that grow in caves from dripping water. It turns out these formations are also incredibly detailed climate archives. Here's how it works. Water seeping through limestone bedrock picks up dissolved minerals, primarily calcium carbonate. When this mineral-rich water drips from a cave ceiling, some of the water evaporates, leaving behind a tiny bit of calcium carbonate. Over thousands of years, these tiny deposits build up into stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites growing up from the floor. The rate of growth depends on how much water is seeping through the rock, which depends on how much rain is falling on the surface above the cave. More rain means more dripping, which means faster growth. Less rain means less dripping and slower growth. But it gets even better. The calcium carbonate in these formations contains oxygen atoms, and these oxygen atoms come in different isotopes, different versions of oxygen with slightly different atomic weights. The ratio of these isotopes in rainwater varies depending on temperature and other climate conditions. When the calcium carbonate precipitates out and becomes part of the stalactite or stalagmite, it preserves that isotope ratio. By carefully sampling a stalactite or stalagmite and analysing the oxygen isotope ratios at different points along its length, scientists can reconstruct past climate conditions with incredible precision. The formations grow in layers, kind of like tree rings, so you can correlate specific layers with specific time periods. Several caves in Greece and the eastern Mediterranean have been studied this way, and the stalactite data confirms what the sediment cores and pollen analysis already suggested. There was a major climate shift around 1200 BCE toward much drier conditions. The oxygen isotope ratios show reduced rainfall. The growth rates of the formations slow down, indicating less water dripping through the rock. Some caves show evidence that certain stalactites actually stopped growing for a period, which means water stopped dripping entirely, a sign of severe drought. One particularly well-studied site is Sorek Cave in Israel, where stalactites have been providing climate data going back tens of thousands of years. The data from around 1200 BCE shows a clear signal of reduced rainfall that lasted for decades, possibly centuries. This wasn't just a dry spell. This was a fundamental shift in regional climate that would have had catastrophic effects on agriculture and water availability. Now you might be wondering, how do scientists know exactly when these various changes happened? How can they look at a layer of sediment or a section of stalactite and say, this is from 1200 BCE? This is where another set of scientific techniques comes in, radiometric dating methods. The most famous is radiocarbon dating, which works on organic materials like wood, bone, or charcoal. But there are other methods too, including uranium series dating for cave formations and optically stimulated luminescence dating for sediments. Luminescence dating is particularly cool, and I use that word advisedly because the technique literally involves light. When sediment grains get buried, they start accumulating a small amount of radiation damage from naturally occurring radioactive elements in the soil. This damage traps electrons in the crystal structure of the minerals. When you expose these sediments to light or heat in a laboratory, the trapped electrons are released as luminescence. Basically, the sediment glows. The amount of luminescence is proportional to how long the sediment has been buried, which lets you calculate its age. It's like the sediment has been keeping track of time by accumulating radiation damage, and scientists can read that clock by making it glow in the dark. If that's not science magic, I don't know what is. By using these various dating methods, researchers can build timelines that align evidence from different sources and different locations. They can confirm that the drought signals in Dead Sea sediments, Sea of Galilee cores, Greek cave formations, and Eastern Mediterranean pollen records all date to the same period. And critically, they can show that these environmental changes coincide with the archaeological evidence for the Bronze Age collapse. The destruction layers in cities, the abandonment of settlements, the breakdown of trade networks. But wait, there's more. Because what caused this dramatic climate shift? For that, they turn to ocean sediment cores, which contain their own climate archives in the form of tiny fossilized plankton. Foraminifera, or forams for short because nobody wants to say foraminifera more times than necessary, are single-celled organisms that live in the ocean and build tiny shells out of calcium carbonate. When they die, these shells sink to the ocean floor and become part of the sediment. Different species of forams live in different temperature ranges, so the types of foram shells in ocean sediment tell you what the water temperature was when they were alive. Additionally, the oxygen isotope ratios in foram shells provide information about ocean temperature and salinity. By analyzing foram assemblages and isotope ratios in sediment cores from the Mediterranean Sea, scientists can reconstruct sea surface temperatures going back thousands of years. And here's what they found. Mediterranean sea surface temperatures dropped around 1200 BCE. We're not talking about a dramatic cooling, maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, but in climate terms, even small changes in ocean temperature can have huge effects on weather patterns. The Mediterranean Sea is a major source of moisture for rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Water evaporates from the sea surface, forms clouds, gets carried inland by winds and falls as rain. This process depends on the sea surface temperature. Warmer water means more evaporation, which means more moisture available for rainfall. Cooler water means less evaporation and less rainfall. So what the foram data is showing is the mechanism. Mediterranean sea surface temperatures decreased, which reduced evaporation, which reduced the amount of moisture available for rainfall, which caused drought conditions across the entire region. It's a domino effect, and scientists can now trace each step of the process through different types of evidence. The ocean cores show the temperature drop, the cave formations show the reduced rainfall, the lake sediments show the environmental impact, and the pollen record shows the effect on vegetation and agriculture. But why did the Mediterranean Sea cool in the first place? This is where the research gets even more interesting, because it connects the Bronze Age collapse to much larger patterns in global climate. Scientists studying climate patterns have identified various natural climate oscillations, recurring patterns of warming and cooling that affect different regions. One of these is the North Atlantic Oscillation, which influences European and Mediterranean climate. Another is the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which originates in the Pacific but has global effects. Changes in solar activity can also influence climate. And there's evidence that volcanic eruptions, which inject huge amounts of particles into the atmosphere, can cause short-term cooling. The evidence suggests that around 1200 BCE, several of these factors may have aligned in ways that caused cooling in the Mediterranean region. There's some evidence of volcanic activity during this period. There are indications of changes in solar output. The North Atlantic Oscillation may have shifted into a pattern that brought cooler, drier conditions to the Mediterranean. It's possible, even likely, that multiple factors combined to create what climate scientists call a regime shift, a relatively rapid transition from one stable climate state to another. What makes this particularly devastating is that Bronze Age civilizations had adapted to the previous climate regime. They developed agricultural systems, settlement patterns, and economic structures based on the expectation of certain rainfall patterns and temperatures. Their crops were varieties that worked well under those conditions. Their water management systems, wells, cisterns, irrigation channels, were designed for that rainfall regime. Their population densities were sustainable given those agricultural yields. Everything was calibrated for the climate they'd experienced for centuries. Then the crops that needed a certain amount of rainfall weren't getting it. Growing seasons changed. Water sources that had been reliable started drying up. Agricultural yields dropped, which meant food shortages, which meant economic stress, which meant social instability. And because these civilizations were all interconnected through trade networks, problems in one area quickly spread to other areas. It was a systemic failure waiting to happen, and the climate shift was the trigger. The geographic extent of this drought is staggering when you map it out. Evidence of aridification, that's the technical term for things getting drier, shows up across the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, parts of Egypt, all experiencing reduced rainfall at the same time. This wasn't a local phenomenon. This was a regional climate shift affecting an area of hundreds of thousands of square miles. Every Bronze Age civilization we've talked about was hit by this. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Canaanite city-states, the Mesopotamian kingdoms, all of them suddenly facing environmental conditions that their agricultural systems weren't designed to handle. And it wasn't just the eastern Mediterranean. Evidence from other regions shows that climate changes were happening globally around this time, though the specific effects varied by region. Parts of the Middle East experienced drought. Some areas of Europe saw cooling and increased storminess. Parts of Asia had monsoon failures. It's looking more and more like the late Bronze Age collapse was part of a global pattern of climate disruption. though it hit some regions harder than others, and the eastern Mediterranean was particularly vulnerable because of how interconnected and specialized the civilizations there had become. The duration of this drought is also crucial to understand. This wasn't a bad decade that people could survive by drawing on stored grain and then bouncing back when rains returned to normal. The evidence suggests drought conditions persisted for 50 years or more. Some researchers argue for over a century of below normal rainfall. That's multiple human generations. Nobody alive would remember when rainfall was normal. Farmers would have tried everything they could think of to adapt, and nothing would have worked consistently. Water sources that dried up stayed dry. Crops that failed kept failing. The economic and social stress would have been relentless, year after year after year. Think about it. In the Bronze Age, roughly 90 to 95% of the population were farmers or pastoralists, people whose lives depended directly on rainfall and agricultural productivity. They weren't producing cash crops to sell in exchange for food grown elsewhere. They were growing the food they and their families would eat, plus enough surplus to pay taxes and trade for essential goods. A single 2 or 3 consecutive bad years was a catastrophe. 10 years of reduced rainfall would destroy communities. 50 years would destroy civilizations. And it's not like they could just move somewhere else. Agricultural land in the Bronze Age was already fully settled. Every good farming location already had communities living there. If you abandoned your land because of drought, where would you go? Other regions were having their own problems. Moving meant becoming refugees in someone else's territory, competing for scarce resources in communities that were already under stress. This is almost certainly part of the story of the Sea Peoples. These were populations displaced by agricultural failure, moving in search of land and resources, sometimes peacefully settling in new areas and sometimes taking what they needed by force. The scientific evidence also helps explain why Egypt survived when other civilizations didn't. Egypt's agriculture was based on the Nile flood, not on rainfall. The Nile's water comes from the African monsoon rains falling on the Ethiopian highlands far to the south. So while the eastern Mediterranean was experiencing severe drought, Egypt still had the Nile, though as we'll discuss later, even the Nile had problems during this period. This gave Egypt a buffer that other civilizations lacked. It wasn't enough to prevent economic and political problems, but it was enough to prevent total collapse. The scientific methods we've been discussing have absolutely revolutionized our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse. Before these techniques were available, historians were limited to studying texts, pottery, and the remains of buildings. They could see that civilizations collapsed, but they couldn't really understand why except by reading ancient descriptions, which were often incomplete or biased. Now we can read the environment itself, extracting information that ancient writers never recorded because they didn't recognize its significance, or because it seemed too obvious to mention. It's like the difference between reading a single eyewitness account of a disaster and having access to weather data, seismic records, soil samples, and satellite imagery. The eyewitness can tell you their experience and perspective, but the scientific data can tell you what actually happened, why it happened, and how widespread the effects were. Both types of evidence are valuable, but together they give you a much more complete picture than either could alone. The interdisciplinary nature of this research is also worth appreciating. This isn't just archaeologists studying ruins or historians reading texts. It's geologists analysing sediment cores, climatologists modelling ancient weather patterns, chemists measuring isotope ratios, biologists identifying pollen grains, physicists using luminescence dating, and oceanographers studying marine microfossils. Each discipline contributes its own expertise and methods, and the synthesis of all this evidence creates an understanding that no single discipline could achieve alone. There's something almost poetic about the fact that the Earth itself preserved evidence that humans never recorded. Bronze Age scribes wrote about battles, treaties, religious ceremonies, and administrative matters, but nobody was keeping detailed rainfall records or tracking climate trends. Why would they? Climate, from their perspective, was just how things were. It varied from year to year, sure, but there was no framework for understanding long-term climate change or recognizing that the environment they'd adapted to could fundamentally shift. Yet all the while, as civilizations rose and fell, cave formations were growing layer by layer, lake sediments were accumulating year by year, and the Earth was keeping records that would eventually tell the story those ancient writers never knew to tell. The irony is that if Bronze Age civilizations had understood climatology the way we do now, if they'd recognized that they were experiencing a major climate shift, it probably wouldn't have helped much. They didn't have the technology to adapt quickly enough. They couldn't engineer massive irrigation systems or develop drought-resistant crop varieties in a few decades. They couldn't import food on the scale necessary to feed entire civilizations. They certainly couldn't modify the climate itself. Understanding what was happening might have let them plan better, maybe organize more orderly migrations or transitions. But the fundamental challenge would have remained. Their entire civilization was built on assumptions about environmental conditions that were no longer valid. Modern climate science studying the Bronze Age collapse has some uncomfortable implications for our own time, but we'll get to that later. For now, the key point is that we now understand that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't primarily a military or political event, though it involved plenty of warfare and political instability. It was fundamentally an environmental catastrophe, a climate shift that Bronze Age civilizations were unprepared for and unable to overcome. The sea peoples, the destroyed cities, the abandoned palaces, the lost writing systems, all of these were symptoms of a crisis that had its roots in changing rainfall patterns and cooling sea surface temperatures. The scale of the drought becomes even more clear when you look at specific sites and what happened to them. Cities that had thrived for centuries suddenly show signs of water stress. Wells were dug deeper. Cisterns were expanded. Water became a precious resource that needed careful management. Agricultural areas that had been productive became marginal. And eventually, as the drought persisted, people gave up and abandoned settlements that had been occupied for hundreds of years. We can see this in the archaeological record through multiple indicators. Pollen analysis shows the shift from cultivated plants to wild vegetation as farmland was abandoned. Sediment carbon dating of final occupation layers tells us when sites were abandoned. The scientific methods give us not just a general picture, but a detailed timeline of how and when different regions were affected. The drought didn't destroy everything simultaneously. Instead, it set off a chain reaction. Agricultural productivity declined, which caused economic stress, which made it harder to maintain trade networks, which disrupted bronze production, which weakened military capabilities, which made kingdoms vulnerable to attack, which caused political instability, which disrupted agricultural organization, which made the food situation worse, which caused more economic problems. It was a vicious cycle, and once it started, it was almost impossible to stop. The environmental evidence also explained something that the military invasion theory never could: why the collapse was so thorough, and why recovery took so long. If the Bronze Age collapse had been caused by conquest, one group defeating and replacing another, you'd expect relatively rapid recovery under the new rulers. That's what usually happens with regime change. But instead, we see centuries of reduced population, abandoned settlements, and loss of complex cultural systems, including writing. That pattern makes sense if the fundamental problem was environmental. Until the climate regime shifted again and rainfall patterns improved, the region couldn't support the population densities and agricultural surpluses that Bronze Age civilizations had depended on. The scientific revolution in studying the past has given us a much more nuanced and accurate understanding of what happened around 1200 BCE. It's also revealed just how vulnerable complex civilizations can be to environmental change. Bronze Age societies were sophisticated, organized, and had persisted for centuries. They seemed permanent and resilient. But they were adapted to specific environmental conditions, and when those conditions changed beyond their ability to adapt, they collapsed despite all their sophistication. This combination of scientific evidence paints a picture that's both more complex and more terrifying than the old invasion theory. It's not a story of civilized people being overwhelmed by barbarians. It's a story of successful civilizations being undermined by environmental changes they couldn't control or even fully understand. The drought didn't just make life harder, it fundamentally broke the systems that Bronze Age societies depended on. And because everything was interconnected, failures in one area cascaded into failures everywhere else. So that's pollen grains, cave formations, ocean sediments, and microscopic fossils have rewritten history, revealing environmental catastrophes that ancient texts never fully described. The Bronze Age civilizations didn't fall because they were weak or backward. They fell because the climate changed in ways that made their way of life unsustainable, and they lacked the technology and knowledge to adapt quickly enough. It's a sobering story, and one that resonates in our own age of climate change, but that's a topic for later. First, we need to understand more about how this ancient climate catastrophe actually played out across different regions, and what it meant for the people who lived through it. Now that we understand the climate science behind the Bronze Age collapse, we need to talk about what that actually meant for people living through it. Because knowing that sea surface temperatures dropped by a degree or two, and rainfall decreased by 20% is one thing. Understanding how those abstract numbers translated into human suffering, economic collapse, and the destruction of civilizations is quite another. This is where the chain reaction comes in, how an environmental problem cascaded through every aspect of Bronze Age society until the entire system came crashing down. Let's start with the most fundamental fact about Bronze Age society. Almost everyone was a farmer. And I don't mean almost everyone in the way we might say almost everyone has a smartphone today. I mean 90 to 95% of the population worked in agriculture. These weren't gentlemen farmers with weekend hobbies, or modern agricultural corporations with machinery and insurance. These were subsistence farmers whose literal survival depended on successfully growing enough food each year to feed their families, with enough surplus left over to pay taxes, buy essential goods, and maybe save a little for bad years. In the Bronze Age, if you weren't a farmer, you were either part of the tiny elite, royalty, nobles, priests, high-ranking officials, or you were a specialist supported by agricultural surplus. That category included soldiers, craftspeople, merchants, scribes, builders, metalworkers, and all the other occupations that make civilizations function. But every single one of those non-farming jobs existed only because farmers were producing enough extra food to support them. No agricultural surplus meant no specialists, which meant no bronze tools, no monumental architecture, no writing, no trade networks, no armies. In short, no civilization as Bronze Age people understood it. This is crucial to understanding why the drought was so devastating. Modern developed nations have maybe 2% of their population working in agriculture, and even in developing nations today, it's usually well under 50%. If modern agriculture suffers problems, we have global supply chains, strategic food reserves, alternative crops, and governmental support systems. Bronze Age civilizations had none of that. And Bronze Age agriculture was incredibly vulnerable to climate variability, way more than most people realize. There were no hybrid drought-resistant crop varieties developed in laboratories. There were no chemical fertilizers to boost yields in marginal conditions. There was no mechanized irrigation on a large scale. Some irrigation channels existed, sure, but nothing like modern systems. Most agriculture was dryland farming, which is a technical term meaning you plant your crops and hope it rains enough. If it didn't rain enough, your crops failed. If it rained at the wrong time, your crops failed. The margin for error was essentially non-existent. The main crops were wheat and barley, cereal grains that had been domesticated thousands of years earlier and formed the basis of Bronze Age diets. These crops need specific rainfall patterns, enough moisture during the growing season, but not so much that they rot or get fungal diseases. They need the rains to come at the right time. Too early or too late and yields plummet. They need moderate temperatures. Too hot and the plants stress, too cold and growth slows. The climate that Bronze Age farmers had adapted to provided these conditions reliably enough that civilizations could flourish. And then, starting around 1200 BCE, those reliable conditions stopped being reliable. Imagine being a farmer in, say, central Greece around 1190 BCE. Your family has been farming the same plot of land for generations. You know every rock, every slope, every quirk of your fields. Your father taught you exactly when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the signs of weather and seasons. Your entire life has been oriented around the agricultural calendar. Planting season, growing season, harvest, storing the grain, surviving the winter, starting again in spring. It's repetitive, it's hard work, and the yields aren't spectacular by modern standards, but it works. You grow enough to feed your family, pay your taxes to the palace, maybe trade some surplus for pottery or cloth or metal tools. Life isn't luxurious, but it's stable and predictable. Then the rains start failing. Not all at once, that would almost be easier to understand. Instead, year after year, the rains are just a bit less than they should be. They come a bit later. The growing season is a bit shorter. Your wheat doesn't grow quite as tall. The kernels are smaller. Your harvest is 20% below normal. Then 30%. Then 40%. You try everything you can think of. You plant earlier. You plant later. You try different field management techniques. You dig irrigation channels to nearby streams, except the streams are running lower than usual too. You pray to the gods and make offerings at the local shrine. Nothing works consistently. After a few bad years, you're dipping into your stored grain, the reserve you were supposed to save for emergencies. After a few more years, that reserve is gone. You're selling or trading anything you can spare to buy grain from neighbours, except they're having the same problems you are, so grain prices are skyrocketing. The tax collectors from the palace still show up expecting their share, because the palace doesn't stop needing grain just because you're not producing enough. You're probably going hungry at this point, rationing food, wondering how you're going to feed your family through the winter. And this isn't a temporary crisis. This is year after year after year of the same problems, maybe getting worse over time with no end in sight. Multiply that scenario by thousands of farming families across Bronze Age civilizations, and you get a sense of the scale of the crisis. Agricultural production was declining across entire regions. Food was becoming scarce. Prices were rising. People were going hungry. And this wasn't hitting just one kingdom. It was affecting all of them simultaneously, which meant nobody had surplus food to export to help others. The interconnected trade networks that had been such a strength during prosperous times became a liability during crisis, because the crisis was everywhere at once. Now let's talk about what this meant for the palace economies that ran Bronze Age civilizations. Remember, the palaces organized large-scale economic activity. They collected taxes in grain and other goods, stored those resources and redistributed them to people who worked for the state: soldiers, craftspeople, officials, priests. The system worked beautifully when agricultural production was sufficient to generate the necessary surplus. But when farming started failing, the palace system started breaking down. First, the palaces could try to maintain tax rates, but you can't extract wheat that doesn't exist, and pushing too hard would just cause farmers to abandon their land entirely. So palace revenues dropped, which meant less resources available for redistribution, which meant the palace couldn't support as many specialist soldiers or officials. The entire administrative apparatus started shrinking and losing capacity. Second, the social contract between rulers and the ruled started breaking down. In good times, people accepted palace authority because the palace provided benefits, protection from enemies, organization of large-scale projects, redistribution of food during local shortages, administration of justice, religious ceremonies to appease the gods. But when harvests were failing year after year and the palace couldn't or wouldn't help, because how could they when everyone was suffering, people started questioning why they should support rulers who couldn't deliver on their implicit promises. Legitimacy eroded, and with it the palace's ability to maintain social order. Third, the palace economy's complexity became a vulnerability. All those specialists, the bronzesmiths, the potters, the scribes, the soldiers, needed to be fed from agricultural surplus. When surplus disappeared, supporting specialists became impossible. This meant craft production declined. Trade declined because there were fewer goods to trade. Administrative capacity declined because scribes and officials couldn't be supported. Military capacity declined because you can't maintain an army if you can't feed them. The entire sophisticated structure of Bronze Age civilization depended on agricultural surplus, and when that disappeared, everything collapsed inward. The effect on bronze production is particularly worth understanding, given that this was literally the Bronze Age. Making bronze requires copper and tin, both of which had to be acquired through long-distance trade. Copper came primarily from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan or other distant sources. The trade networks that brought these materials to bronze working centres depended on several things: secure trade routes, functioning ships and transport, goods to trade in exchange for the metals, and craftspeople with the skills to work the bronze. As the agricultural crisis deepened, all of these broke down. Merchants couldn't operate profitably when pirates infested the trade routes because kingdoms couldn't afford to maintain naval patrols. Ships required maintenance and crews, both of which cost resources that were increasingly scarce. The goods that had been traded for copper and tin, olive oil, wine, textiles, pottery, were becoming harder to produce as specialized craftspeople couldn't be supported. And even if you could get the copper and tin, bronze workshops were shutting down because the smiths needed to be fed and paid, which required resources the palaces no longer had. Without adequate bronze production, you couldn't make tools for farming: plows, hoes, sickles. You couldn't make weapons for soldiers. You couldn't make the various bronze implements used in religious ceremonies, administration, and daily life. Bronze scarcity made the agricultural crisis worse because farmers lacked good tools. It made military weakness worse because armies lacked proper weapons. It made everything worse because bronze was essential to Bronze Age civilization and the supply was drying up. The name of the age wasn't just decorative. Bronze was the material that made this level of civilization possible, and losing access to bronze meant losing the capacity to maintain civilization. Now let's add earthquakes to this already nightmarish scenario, because apparently drought and famine weren't quite enough disaster for the Bronze Age. The Eastern Mediterranean is a seismically active region. It sits on several tectonic plate boundaries that produce regular earthquakes. Most earthquakes are minor, but major destructive earthquakes happen periodically, and there's archaeological evidence of significant seismic activity around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. Multiple sites show destruction layers that were clearly caused by earthquakes, collapsed walls, buildings that fell in certain characteristic patterns, deformation of architecture that indicates seismic shaking rather than fire or warfare. Dating these destruction layers is tricky, but several major sites seem to have experienced earthquake damage in the decades around 1200 BCE. Some scholars have argued that there was an earthquake storm, a period of particularly intense seismic activity across the region, with multiple major quakes hitting different areas within a relatively short time frame. Now, earthquakes are destructive anytime they happen, but they're especially catastrophic during periods of social stress. In normal times, a city hit by an earthquake can be rebuilt. People clear the rubble, reconstruct buildings, and life continues. The kingdom has the resources and organizational capacity to support reconstruction. But during a period when agriculture is failing, food is scarce, and the palace economy is collapsing, an earthquake becomes a death sentence for a city. Imagine a city that's already struggling. Food supplies are low. Trade has declined. The population is under stress. Many specialists have already left because the palace can't support them anymore. Then an earthquake hits. Buildings collapse, killing some residents and leaving others homeless. The city's walls, essential for defense, are damaged. Water systems might be disrupted. Storage facilities for grain might be destroyed, losing precious food supplies in the rubble. In prosperous times, this could be overcome. In crisis times, people would just abandon the city. Why stay and try to rebuild when there's barely enough food to survive anyway? When the resources for reconstruction don't exist? When this might be your opportunity to migrate somewhere that things might be better? Archaeological evidence shows that some Bronze Age cities that experienced earthquake damage around this period were never rebuilt. People just left. The ruins were abandoned, and centuries later new settlements might be built on top of the old ruins, but there was no continuity. The original city died with the earthquake because the society lacked the capacity to rebuild. It's a stark illustration of how cascading crises work. Each problem makes every other problem harder to solve, until eventually the whole system fails. We should also talk about disease, because malnutrition and social stress create perfect conditions for epidemics. When people aren't getting enough food, their immune systems weaken, making them more susceptible to infectious diseases. When populations are migrating and coming into contact with new disease environments, pathogens spread more easily. When hygiene standards decline because social order is breaking down, disease transmission increases. When you combine all these factors, malnutrition, migration, social disruption, you get epidemics. Direct evidence for specific diseases during the Bronze Age collapse is limited because diseases usually don't leave clear archaeological evidence unless they affect bones, which most infectious diseases don't. But we can infer that disease was likely a significant factor based on what we know about how epidemics work. Population stress creates disease vulnerability. Once epidemics start, they spread along trade routes and migration paths. A disease epidemic hitting populations already weakened by famine would have had devastating effects, further reducing population and eliminating the labour force needed for agricultural production and economic recovery. The combination of all these factors — drought, crop failure, famine, economic collapse, earthquakes, likely disease — created what modern researchers call a perfect storm. No single factor was enough to destroy Bronze Age civilizations by itself. If it had just been drought, maybe they could have adapted over time. If it had just been earthquakes, they could have rebuilt. If it had just been economic disruption, maybe they could have reorganized. But all of these hitting simultaneously, each one making the others worse, created a cascading failure that the Bronze Age world simply couldn't handle. This is what systems theorists call synergistic effects, multiple stresses that amplify each other rather than just adding together. Two problems aren't just twice as bad as one problem. They can be exponentially worse because they interact in ways that create new problems. Drought reduces agricultural production, which causes food scarcity, which causes economic problems, which weakens palace authority, which reduces the capacity to maintain order, which allows banditry to flourish, which disrupts trade further, which makes the economic problems worse, which causes more social stress, which leads to rebellions, which further weakens the state. It's a vicious cycle with no clear way to break out of it. The migration aspect of this crisis deserves special attention because it's where the climate catastrophe connects to the sea peoples we discussed earlier. As conditions deteriorated in different regions, populations had few options. You couldn't just stay in place and starve. You had to move anywhere that might offer better prospects. This created waves of migration across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, people abandoning their homes and seeking new places to settle. Some migrations were probably relatively organized, whole communities moving together, maybe with some leadership structure, trying to find new territory where they could re-establish themselves. These groups might have tried to negotiate with existing kingdoms for permission to settle, offering military service or labor in exchange for land. This is likely how some Sea Peoples groups ended up settling in new areas. They were refugees looking for homes, not necessarily conquerors looking to destroy. Other migrations were probably more chaotic. Families or small groups fleeing crisis areas, moving wherever they could, taking what they needed to survive. These groups might have resorted to raiding when they couldn't get resources through peaceful means, which is understandable from their perspective, even if it was devastating for the communities they raided. When your family is starving and you encounter a city with stored grain, the moral calculation gets complicated pretty quickly, and some migrations were probably forced. Populations displaced by other migrating groups, creating a domino effect where one displaced population puts pressure on another, which displaces a third, and so on. It's like a slow-motion collision of populations, with everyone desperate to find somewhere stable to settle, while stable places were rapidly disappearing. The effect of these migrations on the regions they moved through was catastrophic. Even when migrating groups weren't actively hostile, their movement created problems. Large groups of people passing through an area would consume local food resources that were already scarce. They might carry diseases. They created security concerns because settled populations didn't know whether these strangers were peaceful refugees or dangerous raiders. Local authorities had to divert resources to managing or defending against these population movements, further straining systems that were already under severe stress. And here's the really insidious part. Successful regions became targets. If one area was managing to maintain food production better than others, maybe they had better water sources or more resilient agricultural systems, people would migrate toward that area. This meant successful regions got overwhelmed by refugees and raiders, bringing the crisis to them even if they'd initially avoided the worst effects. There was nowhere to hide from a regional catastrophe. Even Egypt, with its Nile-based agriculture that was more resilient than rain-fed agriculture elsewhere, faced massive pressure from displaced populations trying to settle in or pass through Egyptian territory. The archaeological evidence for this migration and crisis is visible in multiple ways. We see sudden destruction layers at many sites, evidence of violent end rather than gradual abandonment. We see changes in pottery styles and burial practices that indicate new populations moving into areas. We see formerly prosperous cities that were abandoned and never reoccupied, or reoccupied only after a gap of decades or centuries. We see a dramatic decline in long-distance trade goods at sites across the region. The exotic imports that had been common during the prosperous Late Bronze Age simply disappear, indicating the trade networks had collapsed. We also see evidence of attempts to fortify and defend settlements that had previously been relatively open. Cities that had no walls or small symbolic walls during prosperous times suddenly built massive fortifications, or strengthened existing walls, or changed layouts to be more defensible. This is the archaeological signature of populations that felt under threat and were desperately trying to protect themselves. The problem was that walls couldn't protect against famine, drought, or economic collapse. They could maybe hold off raiders, at least for a while, but they couldn't solve the underlying crisis. Some sites show evidence of internal violence and social breakdown. There are houses that were burned, not as part of an external attack, but seemingly as part of internal conflict. There are bodies buried hastily or left unburied, a sign that normal funeral practices had broken down, which usually indicates severe social stress. There are hordes of valuables that were buried and never recovered, suggesting people fled suddenly, hoping to return for their buried wealth but never making it back. These are the archaeological signatures of civilizations dying, not gradually declining but collapsing in ways that left people unable to maintain normal social practices. The literacy crisis is particularly striking. Writing systems that had been in use for centuries just stopped being used in many regions. Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean Greek civilizations, disappeared completely. When writing re-emerged in Greece centuries later, it was an entirely different system, the Greek alphabet, borrowed and adapted from Phoenician. Hittite cuneiform disappeared with the collapse of the Hittite Empire and was never revived. Various Canaanite scripts declined or disappeared. The loss of writing indicates a complete breakdown in the social structures that supported literacy. The palace bureaucracies that needed records, the temple administrations, the trade networks that required documentation, the scribal schools that trained new generations of literate people. This literacy loss had cascading effects too. Without writing, you couldn't maintain complex administrative systems. You couldn't keep detailed records. You couldn't document laws or treaties. You couldn't preserve religious texts or historical accounts. Knowledge that had been accumulated over generations was lost because there was no longer a system for recording and transmitting it. When Bronze Age civilizations collapsed, they took their accumulated wisdom with them, creating a genuine dark age where later generations had to reinvent much of what had been lost. The timeline of the collapse varied by region, but it typically played out over 50 to 100 years, roughly 2 to 4 human generations. That's long enough that people born during the collapse might not have personal memory of better times. The crisis became the new normal. Stories of prosperity and great kingdoms might have survived as legends, the good old days that elders talked about. But for many people, the chaos and hardship would have seemed like just how life was. There was no expectation of return to prosperity, because the underlying conditions that had enabled Bronze Age civilization were gone and wouldn't return for centuries. Different regions experienced the collapse differently based on their specific vulnerabilities and circumstances. Mycenaean Greece was hit particularly hard. The palace system completely collapsed. Population declined dramatically. Many settlements were abandoned, and writing was lost for centuries. The Hittite Empire disappeared entirely as a political entity. The capital was abandoned, the kingdom fragmented, and the Hittite language and cuneiform script were lost. The Canaanite city-states mostly collapsed or were severely reduced, though a few like Tyre and Sidon survived as diminished versions of their former selves. Egypt survived but was severely weakened and entered a period of political fragmentation and reduced power. Why did some places survive when others didn't? Several factors seem to have mattered. Access to reliable water sources was crucial. Egypt had the Nile, which gave it an advantage. Political and social flexibility helped. Systems that could adapt and reorganize had better chances than rigid palace systems. Geographic position mattered. Areas that were less central to the collapsing trade networks or less exposed to migrating populations had slightly better odds. And some places probably just got lucky, the right combination of factors at the right time that let them weather the storm when neighbors couldn't. But even places that survived the initial collapse were fundamentally changed. The interconnected, sophisticated, literate civilizations of the late Bronze Age were gone. What emerged after the collapse was different, smaller in scale, less interconnected, less complex in organization. Population levels didn't recover to Bronze Age peaks for centuries. The technology and knowledge systems that had enabled Bronze Age prosperity were lost or severely reduced. It was a genuine civilizational reset, erasing centuries of accumulated progress and forcing subsequent generations to rebuild from a much lower baseline. The human cost of this collapse is almost impossible to calculate, but was certainly immense. That decline came from multiple causes: famine, disease, violence, and migration. People died from starvation and malnutrition-related diseases. They died in conflicts over scarce resources. They died from epidemics that spread through weakened populations. They died as refugees, unable to find new homes or sustain themselves during migration. And many who survived did so in conditions of hardship that would have been unimaginable to their Bronze Age ancestors. The psychological and cultural trauma must have been profound, though it's harder to trace in the archaeological record. Imagine watching your civilization disintegrate over your lifetime. The great palaces and temples that seemed permanent are abandoned or destroyed. The trade goods that had come from across the known world disappear. Writing vanishes. The sophisticated culture you grew up in simplifies into something much more basic, focused on immediate survival. The gods you worshipped apparently aren't answering prayers. The social order you understood is breaking down. Everything that seemed solid and permanent turns out to be fragile and temporary. That experience would have shaped the worldviews of survivors and been transmitted to subsequent generations through stories and cultural memory. Some mythological traditions might preserve echoes of this collapse, stories of great floods or catastrophes that destroyed previous civilizations. The cultural memory of lost greatness might have influenced later societies, creating nostalgic idealization of the past or driving attempts to recreate lost glory. The collapse taught harsh lessons about the fragility of civilization that wouldn't have been forgotten easily. Modern study of the Bronze Age collapse has implications that are uncomfortable to think about. We like to believe that civilization is permanent, that progress is linear, that our sophisticated societies are secure. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that even highly developed, long-lasting civilizations can fail completely when faced with the right combination of stresses. It shows that environmental changes that seem modest in scientific terms, a degree or two of temperature change, 20% reduction in rainfall, can have catastrophic human impacts when they persist long enough and interact with other stresses. It demonstrates that interconnected systems, while efficient in good times, can become vulnerabilities in bad times as problems cascade across network connections. These lessons feel particularly relevant in our age of climate change, supply chain dependencies, and interconnected global systems. We like to think our technology and knowledge make us less vulnerable than Bronze Age civilizations were. Maybe that's true. But maybe we're just as vulnerable in different ways, dependent on our own versions of copper from Cyprus and tin from Afghanistan. Critical resources that flow through complex global networks that we assume will always function, but which might prove more fragile than we expect. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, the key point is understanding how the Bronze Age collapse actually happened. Not as a single dramatic event, but as a cascading failure where environmental stress triggered economic crisis, which triggered social breakdown, which triggered conflict and migration, all amplified by additional disasters like earthquakes and probably disease. It was a perfect storm of catastrophes that Bronze Age civilizations, for all their sophistication, simply couldn't survive. The chain reaction from drought to famine to collapse wasn't instant and it wasn't uniform, but once it started, it proved almost impossible to stop. Each problem fed into others, creating feedback loops that drove the system further from stability. By the time the foundations of Bronze Age civilization, the agricultural surplus that supported everything else, had been undermined by climate change, and everything built on those foundations came crashing down. It would take centuries for the region to recover, and when it did, it would be a different world. The Iron Age, with different technologies, different political systems, and the lessons of the Bronze Age collapse embedded in cultural memory as a warning about the impermanence of even the greatest civilizations. So we've been talking about how Bronze Age civilizations collapsed under the weight of climate catastrophe and cascading crises, but there's an important exception to this story that deserves its own chapter: Egypt. Because while pretty much everyone else was falling apart, Egypt managed to survive. And one of the most fascinating aspects of how Egypt managed this feat involves a city that would later become famous in religious texts as the site of the apocalyptic final battle, Megiddo, or, as the Book of Revelation calls it, Armageddon. Though in the Bronze Age, instead of being the location of the end of the world, it was actually Egypt's desperate attempt to prevent their world from ending. Let's set the scene. We're in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, right when the climate crisis is really hitting hard. Egypt is facing serious problems: drought affecting agriculture, disrupted trade networks, displaced populations threatening their borders, internal economic stress. But Egypt has one massive advantage over pretty much every other Bronze Age civilization: the Nile River. While everyone else is dependent on rainfall for agriculture, Egypt's farming system is based on the Nile's annual flood. Every year the river would overflow its banks, depositing nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain and providing moisture for crops. It was, from an agricultural perspective, a remarkably reliable system that made Egypt the wealthiest and most stable kingdom in the ancient Near East for millennia. However, and this is a big however, the Nile flood comes from monsoon rains falling on the Ethiopian highlands far to the south. That water then flows down the Blue Nile and White Nile, converging in Sudan before flowing north through Egypt to the Mediterranean. The entire system depends on those distant rains falling reliably, and while Egypt's local rainfall didn't matter much for their agriculture, changes in the African monsoon pattern definitely did. We'll discuss evidence of Nile problems later, but for now, the key point is that even Egypt wasn't completely immune to the climate crisis affecting the broader region. So Egyptian administrators, who were nothing if not pragmatic, recognized they had a problem. The kingdom needed more food security. Relying solely on the Nile flood was becoming risky. They needed backup agricultural capacity somewhere that could supplement domestic production and provide insurance against years when the Nile flood was inadequate. And they had the perfect location already under their control: Canaan, the region that roughly corresponds to modern Israel, Palestine, and parts of Lebanon and Syria. Egypt had been politically dominant in Canaan for centuries by this point. They didn't directly administer the entire region. Canaan was a patchwork of city-states that technically had their own rulers, but those rulers were Egyptian vassals, paying tribute, following Egyptian foreign policy, and generally doing what they were told or facing the consequences. This arrangement had worked well for Egypt. They got tribute, controlled important trade routes, and had a buffer zone between Egypt proper and the major powers to the north like the Hittites. And now they were going to leverage this control to solve their food security problem. The centerpiece of this strategy was Megiddo. Now, Megiddo was already an important city before Egypt ramped up operations there. It had been continuously occupied for thousands of years and sat at a strategic location controlling a key pass through the Carmel mountain range. The Via Maris, one of the ancient world's major trade routes connecting Egypt with Syria and Mesopotamia, ran right through Megiddo. Armies marching between Egypt and the north had to pass through or near Megiddo. It was prime real estate, strategically speaking, and Egypt had made sure to keep it firmly under their influence. But during the crisis period, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, Egypt transformed Megiddo from just another important Canaanite city into something more like a massive agricultural production center aimed at feeding Egypt. The archaeological evidence for this is remarkably clear and comes from extensive excavations at the site. What researchers found was a dramatic intensification of agricultural activity and storage capacity during precisely the period when the Bronze Age collapse was happening elsewhere. While other cities were being abandoned or destroyed, Megiddo was being built up and expanded to maximize food production. The evidence starts with storage facilities. Archaeologists excavating at Megiddo found massive silos and storage buildings dating to this period, far more than the city itself would have needed for its own population. These weren't small storage rooms. We're talking about industrial-scale grain storage capacity. The silos were built using sophisticated techniques to keep grain dry and protected from pests, which is harder than it sounds when you're dealing with tons of wheat and barley in a climate where moisture and insects are constant threats. The investment in these facilities was substantial, representing a major allocation of resources and labour. What's particularly telling is that this storage capacity was built up during the very period when you'd expect economic investment to be declining everywhere else due to the crisis. While Mycenaean palaces were being abandoned and Hittite cities were being destroyed, somebody was pouring resources into expanding Megiddo's grain storage infrastructure. That somebody was almost certainly the Egyptian government, which means they considered this important enough to justify major investment, even as everything else was falling apart. This wasn't just business as usual, this was a strategic priority. The agricultural intensification shows up in other ways too. Analysis of plant remains from this period at Megiddo shows emphasis on cereal crops, wheat and barley, at the expense of other agricultural products. This makes sense if your goal is maximizing caloric production for export to Egypt. Cereals provide more calories per acre than most other crops, and can be stored for long periods without spoiling, making them ideal for long-distance transport and strategic reserves. Megiddo was being optimized as a grain factory, basically, focused on producing as much exportable food as possible. The faunal remains, animal bones from this period show a shift in livestock management. There's an increase in cattle and a relative decrease in sheep and goats compared to earlier periods. This is significant because cattle are less suited to arid conditions than sheep and goats, which are the traditional livestock of drier Mediterranean climates. Sheep and goats can survive on marginal vegetation and handle drought conditions better than cattle. So why would anyone increase cattle raising during a period of climate stress? The answer is that cattle are more productive in terms of meat, dairy and draft power, if you have adequate fodder and water for them. They're a higher input, higher output agricultural choice compared to sheep and goats. The shift toward cattle suggests that Megiddo had access to sufficient agricultural resources to support them, probably including irrigation and intensive fodder production. It also suggests Egyptian direction, since Egypt had a long tradition of cattle husbandry and would have had the expertise to manage cattle even in challenging conditions. This wasn't subsistence farming. This was sophisticated agricultural management aimed at maximizing production. There's also evidence of improved irrigation systems being constructed or expanded during this period. Canaan's agriculture was traditionally dependent on rainfall, but the Megiddo region had access to springs and could develop irrigation infrastructure to supplement natural rainfall. During a period of reduced precipitation, having irrigation would have been a huge advantage, allowing continued or even increased agricultural production, while rain-fed agriculture elsewhere was failing. The archaeological evidence suggests significant investment in water management, channels, cisterns, and other infrastructure designed to capture, store, and distribute water for agricultural use. Now let's talk about the logistics of this operation, because moving large quantities of grain from Canaan to Egypt was no small feat in the Bronze Age. You couldn't just load it on trucks and drive it down a highway. The most practical route would have been by ship along the coast, but that required a functioning port, ships capable of carrying bulk grain cargoes, and safe sea routes that weren't infested with pirates. Overland transport was possible, but much more labour-intensive and expensive. You'd need pack animals or wagons, guards to protect the caravans, and would have to move through potentially hostile territory. Egypt apparently considered this worth the trouble and expense, which tells you how serious they thought their food security problem was. They weren't doing this for fun or out of surplus resources. They were doing it because they believed it was necessary for Egypt's survival. The fact that they maintained this system during a period of regional crisis, when trade networks elsewhere were collapsing, shows remarkable administrative capacity and political will. Egypt's bureaucratic system, for all its flaws, was still functioning well enough to organize complex logistics operations across hundreds of miles of territory. The relationship between Megiddo and Egypt during this period seems to have been essentially colonial in modern terms, though that's a word we should use carefully when discussing the ancient world. Egypt was using Canaan's agricultural capacity to supplement their own food supply, extracting resources from subject territories to benefit the imperial core. The local population of Megiddo and surrounding areas would have been working to produce grain for export to Egypt, probably not entirely voluntarily. Whether this was done through taxation, forced labour, or some combination probably varied, but the end result was that Canaanite agricultural production was being redirected to serve Egyptian needs. How did the local population feel about this? We don't have direct testimony, unfortunately. Bronze Age Canaanite farmers didn't leave us their thoughts about being incorporated into Egypt's emergency food production system, but we can make some educated guesses. On one hand, being part of this system might have provided some stability and protection during a chaotic period. Egyptian authority meant Egyptian protection, potentially from raiders and displaced populations. Being part of a functioning state system was probably better than being caught in the general collapse happening elsewhere. On the other hand, having your agricultural surplus extracted to feed Egyptians while you and your neighbours were also dealing with climate stress and food insecurity couldn't have been popular. It's the classic imperial dynamic. The imperial core maintains itself by drawing resources from the periphery, even when the periphery is also suffering. The fact that Egypt maintained control over Canaan throughout this period suggests they had the military capacity to enforce their demands, which implies local cooperation wasn't entirely voluntary. The scale of this operation is impressive when you think about it. Egypt was simultaneously dealing with internal problems, fighting off the Sea Peoples and other threats, maintaining a large bureaucracy and military, and running what amounted to an overseas agricultural colony designed to supplement their domestic food production. That takes organizational capacity that most Bronze Age kingdoms simply didn't have. The Egyptian state, with its centuries-old administrative traditions and infrastructure, was pulling off logistics that would have been impossible for the palace economies elsewhere that were collapsing under stress. There's also archaeological finds include Egyptian-style pottery, Egyptian religious items, and architectural features that show Egyptian influence. These aren't just trade goods, they're evidence of Egyptians living at the site, probably officials overseeing the agricultural operations, scribes keeping records, perhaps garrison troops providing security. Egypt wasn't just receiving tribute from a distant vassal. They were directly managing this operation, which required maintaining permanent administrative infrastructure in Canaan. The written evidence for this period is limited but suggestive. Egyptian texts mention Canaan and its cities during this period, though the records aren't detailed enough to fully document the agricultural operations we can see in the archaeology. The famous Medinet Habu inscriptions we discussed earlier mention Egyptian control over Asian territories, including Canaan. There are also administrative documents, less dramatic than the battle inscriptions but more informative for economic historians, that record grain shipments and tribute payments from Levantine territories to Egypt. This is striking. The city was thriving during a period when its neighbours were collapsing. That kind of prosperity during a regional crisis doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone with power and resources, in this case, Egypt, was investing heavily in maintaining and developing this particular site for strategic reasons. The fortifications at Megiddo also show interesting patterns. The city walls were substantial and well maintained during this period, suggesting significant investment in defense. This makes sense for a strategically important agricultural center that might be targeted by raiders or displaced populations. Egypt needed to protect their investment, and that meant making Megiddo defensible. The gates were particularly impressive, multiple chambered structures that could be defended by relatively small numbers of troops against much larger attacking forces. This was military architecture reflecting serious defensive concerns. Inside the city, the layout seems to have been reorganized during this period to maximize storage and processing of agricultural products. There are clusters of buildings that appear to be administrative centers, likely where Egyptian officials coordinated the grain collection and shipment operations. There are workshops for making storage jars and other containers needed for the agricultural economy. The city was being optimized for its new role as a crucial node in Egypt's food security network. The environmental evidence from Megiddo is also revealing. Pollen analysis and study of plant remains show that the immediate area around Megiddo maintained agricultural productivity during the period when many other regions were experiencing severe agricultural decline. This wasn't because Megiddo somehow escaped the drought. The same climate patterns affected the entire region. Rather, it was because of the irrigation infrastructure and intensive agricultural management we mentioned earlier. This couldn't work everywhere. It required specific conditions like access to water sources, suitable soil, defensible location, and proximity to transport routes. Megiddo had all of these, which is why Egypt focused their efforts there. But the fact that it was possible at all shows that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't purely environmental determinism. Human choices and organizational capacity mattered. Egypt's decision to invest in Megiddo, their ability to organize the necessary resources and labor, their maintenance of the administrative and military infrastructure to make it work, all of this shows agency and adaptation in the face of crisis. However, and this is important, this strategy had limits. Megiddo's agricultural production could supplement Egypt's domestic supply, but it couldn't replace it. Egypt still depended fundamentally on the Nile flood for most of their food. If the Nile really failed, Megiddo couldn't produce enough to prevent famine in Egypt. So this was a risk management strategy, not a complete solution. It provided a buffer, some additional security, but it didn't make Egypt invulnerable to the broader climate crisis. There's also the question of sustainability. Intensive agriculture of the kind Egypt was promoting at Megiddo can deplete soil fertility over time if not carefully managed. Irrigation can cause salt buildup in soil, eventually making land unproductive. This is what happened to Mesopotamian agriculture in later periods, and was a constant concern in ancient agricultural systems. The emphasis on cattle would have required substantial fodder production, putting additional pressure on agricultural land. It's unclear whether the Egyptian administrators at Megiddo were concerned with long-term sustainability, or were just maximizing short-term production to get through the immediate crisis. The fate of this system tells us something about its effectiveness and limits. Megiddo continued to function as an important city for centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, though its role evolved. Egyptian direct control over Canaan weakened after the crisis period as Egypt itself entered a period of political fragmentation. The intensive agricultural system focused on exports to Egypt presumably declined or ended when Egypt no longer had the capacity to maintain it. But from a broader perspective, the Megiddo strategy shows that Egyptian authorities understood what we'd now call supply chain diversification. They recognized that depending solely on domestic agriculture made them vulnerable to any disruption in the Nile flood system. By developing alternative sources of food production in territories they controlled, they reduced, though didn't eliminate, that vulnerability. It's the ancient equivalent of a modern country developing strategic food reserves and diverse sources of agricultural imports to guard against domestic crop failures. The strategy also demonstrates sophisticated understanding of agricultural management under stress conditions. The shift to different livestock, the investment in irrigation, the intensification of cereal production, these weren't random responses. They were calculated adaptations aimed at maintaining productivity despite challenging environmental conditions. Someone in the Egyptian administration was thinking systematically about how to maintain food security during a climate crisis, and then marshalling the resources to implement their plans. That's impressive state capacity for any pre-modern society. There's something poignant about Megiddo's role in this story. Here's a city that would later be mythologized as the site of the final apocalyptic battle. But during the Bronze Age collapse, which was actually apocalyptic for many civilizations, it was a center of survival and adaptation. While the world around it was falling apart, Megiddo was Egypt's attempt to build resilience against catastrophe. It didn't. The archaeological evidence from Megiddo also provides a useful counterpoint to the narrative of inevitable collapse. Yes, the Bronze Age world fell apart. Yes, the climate crisis was devastating and widespread. But it wasn't uniformly catastrophic everywhere, and human agency mattered. Societies that could adapt, that had sufficient organizational capacity to respond to changing conditions, that could mobilize resources for strategic priorities, those societies had better survival odds. Egypt's ability to maintain and even expand operations at Megiddo during the worst of the crisis shows that collapse wasn't purely determined by environmental factors. Political organization, administrative capacity, and strategic planning made a difference. Of course, we should note that Egypt's success came partly at the expense of Canaan. The resources invested in Megiddo, the agricultural production exported to Egypt, the administrative overhead, all of this was drawn from Canaanite territories and populations. Egypt survived partly by extracting resources from its subject territories during a crisis when those territories were also suffering. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Imperial cores often survive crises better than peripheries, sometimes precisely because they can draw resources from those peripheries. The long-term consequences of Egypt's Megiddo strategy are difficult to assess because so many other factors were also changing. Did it significantly extend Egypt's New Kingdom period? Did it prevent more serious internal unrest in Egypt by maintaining food supplies? Did it allow Egypt to maintain military capability that would have otherwise declined faster? These are counterfactual questions, asking what would have happened if Egypt hadn't pursued this strategy, which are always speculative. But the fact that Egypt invested so heavily in this approach suggests they thought it was crucial to their survival. What we can say with confidence is that the Megiddo operation represents one of the more successful adaptation strategies attempted during the Bronze Age collapse. It didn't prevent Egypt from eventually declining. No strategy could have maintained New Kingdom power levels indefinitely given the broader regional crisis, but it gave Egypt a buffer that other civilizations lacked. That buffer translated into decades of continued functioning as an organized state, while neighbors were collapsing into dark ages. The contrast with other civilizations is instructive. The Hittites apparently didn't develop comparable strategies for agricultural diversification or intensification. When their core agricultural regions were hit by drought, they didn't have effective backup systems. The Mycenaean palaces seem to have intensified agricultural production in their core territories, but didn't develop external sources the way Egypt did with Megiddo. When their domestic agriculture failed, they had nowhere to turn. Egypt's advantages weren't just environmental, having the Nile was crucial, but also organizational and strategic. Modern research on ancient climate adaptation has increasingly focused on cases like Megiddo because they show that societies facing environmental stress had options, even if those options were constrained and often inadequate. The deterministic narrative, climate changed, civilizations collapsed, nothing could be done, is too simple. The more nuanced narrative is that climate change created severe challenges. Some societies adapted better than others based on their organizational capacity and resources, but ultimately the scale of change overwhelmed even the more successful adaptation strategies. Egypt adapted better than most and survived when many didn't, but still suffered significant damage. There's also a question of how conscious this strategy was. Did Egyptian administrators explicitly articulate something like, "We're facing a climate crisis and need to develop alternative food sources in Canaan"? Or was it more reactive? "The Nile flood was poor this year. We need more grain. Megiddo has good agricultural potential. Let's intensify production there." With the strategic pattern emerging from accumulated responses to immediate problems rather than from a grand plan. The archaeological evidence can't tell us the thought processes, only the results. My guess, for what it's worth, is that it was probably somewhere in between. Egyptian officials recognized they had food security problems, Canaan was already under their control and had agricultural potential, so intensifying production there was an obvious response. But this then developed into a more systematic strategy as the crisis persisted and the approach proved effective. Ancient administrators were smart and practical. They didn't need modern economic theory to figure out that diversifying food sources reduced risk. The story of Megiddo during the Bronze Age collapse also reminds us that behind all the grand patterns and large-scale processes we've been discussing, there were real people making decisions, working in fields, managing granaries, shipping grain, defending walls. The strategy we can see in the archaeological record required thousands of people doing specific jobs, coordinated through administrative systems that somehow continued functioning during a regional crisis. That's actually remarkable. Maintaining that kind of organized economic activity during catastrophic times shows impressive social resilience. For the people living in and around Megiddo during this period, life would have been a strange mix of crisis and relative stability. Yes, the broader world was collapsing. Yes, climate stress was affecting everyone. But Megiddo itself was functioning, was economically active, had Egyptian backing and protection, had employment in agricultural production and processing. Compared to being in a city that was being abandoned or destroyed, being in Megiddo was probably pretty good, even if it meant working hard to produce grain for Egypt. We should also note what this strategy didn't include. Egypt didn't try to resettle large Egyptian populations in Canaan to develop the agriculture there. It remained primarily a Canaanite region with Egyptian administration. Egypt didn't try to fundamentally restructure Canaanite society. They worked within existing social structures, just directing agricultural production for their purposes. Egypt didn't try to defend all of Canaan equally. They concentrated resources on strategically important sites like Megiddo, while letting less important areas fend for themselves. These were pragmatic choices reflecting limited resources and strategic priorities. The Megiddo granary system also had symbolic importance beyond its practical function. For Egyptian authorities, maintaining this system demonstrated that Egypt was still functioning as a great power despite the crisis. This mattered for domestic legitimacy, showing the Egyptian population that their rulers were capable and in control, and for international prestige, showing other kingdoms that Egypt remained formidable despite the troubles plaguing the region. In the end, the Megiddo strategy was a success within its limits. It didn't save the Bronze Age world, nothing could have done that, but it helped Egypt survive the collapse better than most civilizations. It demonstrated that adaptive strategies, backed by sufficient organizational capacity, could mitigate even severe environmental crises. Even the Nile had problems during this period, and even Egypt's sophisticated administrative system was stressed to its breaking point. The next part of our story needs to examine what was happening inside Egypt itself during the crisis, because the view from the Nile Delta tells us just how close even the most resilient Bronze Age civilization came to catastrophic failure. So we've just spent considerable time discussing how Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse better than most civilizations, largely because they had the Nile River providing reliable agricultural productivity when everyone else's rain-fed agriculture was failing. And that's all true. The Nile was Egypt's lifeline and gave them a crucial advantage. But here's the uncomfortable truth that we need to address. Even the Nile had problems during this period. Egypt's insurance policy against climate catastrophe turned out to have some fine print that nobody particularly wanted to read. The river that had sustained Egyptian civilization for thousands of years started showing worrying signs of stress. And those signs tell us just how serious the Bronze Age collapse crisis really was. The evidence for Nile problems comes from a fascinating area of research, river sedimentology, which is the study of sediments deposited by rivers. When a river floods regularly, it leaves behind layers of sediment, silt, sand, organic material that can be studied thousands of years later to reconstruct the river's behavior. The Nile has been leaving these sediment records for millennia, and scientists studying them have found something remarkable and disturbing. Between roughly 1280 and 12 to 20 BCE, the Nile's flow appears to have been significantly reduced. The sediment layers from this period show characteristics consistent with lower water volumes, fewer flood pulses, and a generally less vigorous river system. This is the kind of finding that makes archaeologists sit up and pay attention, because the implications are enormous. The Nile flood was, not to put too fine a point on it, the entire basis of Egyptian civilization. Everything Egypt accomplished for thousands of years depended on that annual flood. The flood deposited fertile silt that replenished soil nutrients. It provided moisture for crops. It filled irrigation channels and water storage systems. The timing and height of the flood determined whether Egypt would have abundant harvests or famine. The Greek historian Herodotus famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he wasn't exaggerating. Without the Nile flood, Egypt was just a strip of river valley surrounded by inhospitable desert. With the flood, it was one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world. So when the sediment evidence suggests the Nile was underperforming during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, right during the Bronze Age collapse, that's a big deal. It means Egypt's supposed immunity to the climate crisis wasn't complete. They were better off than their neighbours who depended on rainfall that had essentially stopped, sure, but they weren't safe. Even Egypt, with all its advantages, was experiencing environmental stress that threatened the foundation of their civilization. The mechanism behind the Nile's problems is related to the same climate patterns affecting the broader region, but with a twist. The Nile's water comes from two main sources: the Blue Nile, which originates in the Ethiopian highlands and provides about 60% of the river's water, and the White Nile, which comes from East Africa's Great Lakes and provides most of the base flow. The Blue Nile's contribution is highly seasonal, driven by monsoon rains that fall on the Ethiopian highlands during summer. This is what caused the famous annual flood, massive amounts of water surging down from the highlands between July and October, reaching Egypt and inundating the floodplain. The African monsoon system that feeds the Blue Nile is connected to global climate patterns, particularly sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean and changes in atmospheric circulation patterns over Africa. When these patterns shift, and they did around 1200 BCE, the monsoon weakens, which means less rain on the Ethiopian highlands, which means less water flowing down the Blue Nile, which means a weaker flood in Egypt. It's a chain of causation that connects tiny changes in ocean temperatures to the fate of Egyptian civilization, which is both fascinating from a scientific perspective and terrifying from a human one. The sediment evidence shows several indicators of reduced Nile flow during this period. First, there's less sediment deposition overall, a sign that the river wasn't carrying as much material, which it would do when flows were lower. Second, the chemical composition of the sediment changes in ways consistent with less vigorous flooding. Third, the depth of flood deposits is reduced compared to earlier and later periods. And fourth, this is particularly clever, researchers can look at the size distribution of sediment particles. Stronger floods carry larger particles further downstream, while weaker floods deposit more fine particles. The sediment from the crisis period shows patterns consistent with weaker flood pulses. Now you might be wondering how much of a reduction we're talking about. Unfortunately, translating sediment characteristics into precise measurements of ancient river flow is complicated and involves a lot of uncertainty. But researchers estimate the Nile flood during the worst years of this period might have been reduced by 20 to 40% compared to normal levels. That might not sound catastrophic. The river was still flooding after all, just not as vigorously, but in the context of Egyptian agriculture it was devastating. Egyptian farming was calibrated to specific flood levels. Too low and large areas of agricultural land wouldn't be flooded at all, meaning no water for crops and no silt deposition. Too high, the system had a fairly narrow optimal range, and the climate crisis pushed the Nile out of that range. There's also nilometers, structures built to measure the height of the annual flood, show that Egyptians were very concerned about flood levels and tracked them carefully. While we don't have continuous nilometer records from the Late Bronze Age, references in texts to the flood height and its adequacy become more frequent and more worried in tone during the crisis period. There are inscriptions mentioning low floods, prayers to the gods for better floods, and administrative documents dealing with the consequences of inadequate flooding. The textual evidence, fragmentary as it is, matches what the sediment is telling us. The timing of the Nile crisis is particularly unfortunate, or perhaps we should say it's precisely what you'd expect if everything was going wrong at once. The Nile problems hit during the same decades when the Eastern Mediterranean was experiencing severe drought, when trade networks were collapsing, when the sea peoples were on the move, when earthquakes were hitting cities. Egypt was dealing with external threats and internal stress simultaneously, and now even their most reliable resource, the Nile, was becoming unreliable. It's that perfect storm scenario we discussed earlier, except now we're seeing how it affected even the most resilient civilization of the Bronze Age. The consequences for Egyptian society were severe and show up in multiple types of evidence. Let's start with what might be the most famous labor dispute in ancient history, the strike at Deir el-Medina during the reign of Ramesses III. Deir el-Medina was the village where the skilled workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived. These weren't ordinary laborers. They were specialized craftsmen, artists, and workers who received regular wages in the form of grain rations from the state. It was cushy employment by Bronze Age standards with job security, professional prestige, and steady food supplies. Or at least it was supposed to be steady. In the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, around 1156 BCE, right in the thick of the crisis, the workers at Deir el-Medina did something unprecedented. They went on strike. They put down their tools and refused to work, staging a sit-in at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings. Their grievance? The state hadn't delivered their grain rations. For months, apparently, their wages had been delayed or reduced. And they weren't willing to accept it quietly. The texts describing this event, preserved on ostraca, which are pottery sherds used as writing surfaces, are remarkable. The workers are explicit about their demands. They want their rations, and they want them now. They're not particularly deferential to authority, which must have shocked officials who expected obedience from state workers. One text records them saying something like, "We have reached this place because of hunger and thirst. We have no clothes, no ointment, no fish, no vegetables." These were skilled workers who should have been living comfortably, and they're claiming they don't even have basic necessities. That's a sign of serious state dysfunction. The strike worked, sort of. The authorities eventually delivered some rations and the workers went back to work. But the fact that it happened at all is significant. For workers to strike, they had to believe the state couldn't or wouldn't punish them too severely, which suggests weakened state authority. They had to be desperate enough that the risk of punishment seemed worth it. And most importantly, the fact that the state couldn't deliver wages on time to prioritised workers in a royal construction project indicates severe supply problems in the Egyptian administrative system. If they couldn't keep the tomb workers fed, how were ordinary farmers and labourers faring? This wasn't an isolated incident. The texts from Deir el-Medina record multiple disputes over wages during this period, suggesting chronic problems with the supply system. Other evidence from around Egypt shows similar patterns of administrative stress. There are records of grain prices rising dramatically, economic inflation caused by scarcity. There are reports of banditry and theft increasing. There are signs that the elaborate redistributive system that was supposed to feed people working for the state was breaking down under the stress of reduced agricultural productivity. And then there are the tomb robberies, which tell their own story of social breakdown. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings and other royal necropoli were supposed to be sacred, inviolable, protected by religious fear and state power. They contained enormous wealth: gold, precious stones, valuable goods buried with the deceased pharaohs and nobles. For centuries, these tombs had remained mostly secure despite their obvious wealth, because robbing a pharaoh's tomb was literally about the most serious crime you could commit in ancient Egypt, both legally and religiously. You weren't just stealing, you were violating the dead, disturbing the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife and committing sacrilege against the gods. The punishment if caught was death, often in particularly unpleasant ways. But during the late New Kingdom, tomb robberies became epidemic. We know this because the Egyptians conducted investigations and trials, and the records of these proceedings have survived. What's striking is that the robberies weren't just opportunistic crimes by desperate individuals. They involved organised gangs that included people who should have been protecting the tombs. Guards, priests, officials, people with access and knowledge were participating in systematic looting of the royal necropoli. Some robberies were discovered when the gang started fighting among themselves over the split of the loot, which led to informants going to authorities. The trials reveal complex conspiracies involving dozens of people working together to rob tombs, melt down precious metals, and sell stolen goods. This is social breakdown writ large. When people are willing to commit crimes that violate the most fundamental religious and social norms, when officials and priests are participating in tomb robbery, when the fear of punishment and divine retribution isn't enough to prevent crime, that indicates a society under extreme stress. People were clearly desperate enough for resources that even sacred prohibitions weren't stopping them. And the fact that these crimes were so widespread suggests the state's capacity to maintain order and enforce laws was severely compromised. The tomb robbery trials also reveal interesting details about economic conditions. The thieves weren't stealing for fun, they needed the resources. Some testimonies mention dividing up stolen gold and silver to buy grain because food was scarce and expensive. The stolen wealth was being converted into survival necessities. This is classic crisis behaviour. When normal economic channels fail, black markets emerge, crime increases, and people do whatever they must to survive. That this was happening in Egypt, wealthy, organised, powerful Egypt, shows how serious the crisis had become. The internal problems in Egypt during this period weren't just economic, they were also political. The New Kingdom was beginning its long decline toward the Third Intermediate Period, when Egypt would fragment into competing power centres. The causes of this decline were complex and not purely due to the Bronze Age collapse crisis, but the climate and economic stress certainly contributed. Maintaining unified political control over a large territory requires resources. You need to pay armies, support administrators, fund royal building projects that demonstrate power, conduct religious ceremonies that legitimize rule. When resources become scarce, maintaining that control becomes harder. There's evidence of increasing military problems along Egypt's borders during this period. Aside from the Sea People's invasions that Ramesses III fought off, there were troubles with Libyan tribes to the west, with Nubian territories to the south, with maintaining control over Canaan and Syria in the north. Egypt was fighting on multiple fronts, which required significant military resources at a time when those resources were increasingly scarce. The military campaigns were technically successful. Ramesses III did defeat his enemies, as his inscriptions loudly proclaim, but they were expensive, and Egypt's capacity to sustain that level of military activity was clearly declining. There were plots against pharaohs, including a documented conspiracy to assassinate Ramesses III, a plot that apparently involved members of the royal household and high officials. Whether it succeeded or not is debated. The historical record is unclear, but the fact that such a conspiracy was attempted shows serious problems within the elite. In a strong, secure state, attempting to assassinate the pharaoh would be unthinkably dangerous. That people tried it suggests they thought they had a chance of succeeding, which indicates political fragmentation and weakened royal authority. The religious sphere also shows signs of stress. Temple estates, which were major economic institutions controlling significant agricultural land and resources, appear to have struggled during this period. Some temples reduced their operations. Others increased their land holdings, possibly as desperate attempts to maintain income as overall economic activity declined. The relationship between temples and the state became more complicated, with temples sometimes acting more independently than they had during the height of the New Kingdom. This is another sign of weakening central control. When religious institutions stop being dependent on royal patronage and start acting as independent power centers, that suggests the state isn't as powerful as it used to be. The artistic and architectural evidence from this period also tells a story of declining resources. The last few pharaohs of the New Kingdom continued building temples and monuments. You couldn't be pharaoh without building things, it was basically in the job description. But the scale and quality declined noticeably compared to the earlier New Kingdom. Ramesses III built extensively, but his successors managed progressively less. Building projects were left unfinished. Stone was increasingly reused from earlier monuments rather than newly quarried. Decorative relief work became less elaborate and more perfunctory. These aren't just aesthetic changes, they're economic indicators showing that fewer resources were available for monumental construction. The demographic evidence, though difficult to interpret, suggests population decline in Egypt during this period. Settlement patterns show some sites being abandoned or reduced in size. The number of administrative positions mentioned in text seems to decrease. The scale of military forces that could be mobilized declined. All of these point toward a smaller population base, which could result from multiple factors: mortality from famine and disease, emigration from stressed regions, reduced birth rates during hard times. Population decline would create a vicious cycle. Fewer people meant less agricultural production, which meant less surplus to support specialists and state functions, which meant further economic decline. It's important to note that Egypt didn't collapse the way other Bronze Age civilizations did. The state continued to function. Pharaohs continued to rule. The administrative system continued operating, though with reduced capacity. Temples continued performing their functions. Egyptian culture and identity persisted. So from one perspective, Egypt's crisis management was successful. They survived when others didn't. But from another perspective, the evidence of strikes, tomb robberies, administrative dysfunction, and resource scarcity shows that Egypt came closer to collapse than the triumphant royal inscriptions would suggest. The Medinet Habu reliefs show Ramesses III victorious over all enemies, but the Deir el-Medina ostraca show his workers going on strike because they weren't being paid. Both the Nile climate patterns fluctuate, and the African monsoon would have varied from year to year even within the overall pattern of reduced rainfall. Some years probably had adequate Nile floods, which would have provided temporary relief and prevented complete disaster. But the recurrent problems, the unpredictability, the years when the flood was inadequate, this chronic stress wore down Egyptian resilience and prevented full recovery even when conditions temporarily improved. It's like being punched repeatedly. Even if individual punches aren't fatal, eventually the accumulated damage becomes critical. The evidence from Nile sediments, combined with the historical evidence of strikes and social problems, creates a picture of Egypt struggling with environmental stress that affected even their most reliable resource. The Nile hadn't failed completely. If it had, Egypt would have collapsed entirely, but it was stressed enough to cause serious problems throughout Egyptian society. The buffer that the Nile provided was real and significant, but it wasn't unlimited. When the Megiddo strategy we discussed earlier was implemented, it was probably driven partly by recognition that even the Nile couldn't be fully relied upon anymore. There's something almost tragic about Egypt's situation during this period. They'd survived and thrived for thousands of years based on the Nile. They'd built an entire civilization around the rhythm of the annual flood. Their religious calendar, their agricultural practices, their economic system, their political structure, everything was organized around the Nile's reliable provision of water and fertile silt. They'd weathered occasional bad floods before and recovered. But this was different. This was a sustained period when the fundamental assumption underlying their entire civilization, that the Nile would always provide, turned out to be conditional. When even the Nile could fail, what was secure? Modern climate research has provided context for what Egypt experienced. The weakening of the African monsoon during the Late Bronze Age was part of larger patterns of climate variability affecting multiple regions. It wasn't, and critically, it hit when Egypt was already dealing with external threats and regional instability, so the climate stress was amplified by all the other problems happening simultaneously. The recovery of the Nile system in subsequent centuries allowed Egypt to survive and eventually rebuild, though never quite returning to the heights of New Kingdom power. The third intermediate period that followed was characterized by political fragmentation, with Egypt divided among competing dynasties and power centers. This fragmentation wasn't solely caused by the Late Bronze Age crisis. Political and social factors also played roles, but the economic damage from the Nile crisis and the associated problems certainly contributed to weakening the centralized state structure that had characterized the New Kingdom. Looking at the evidence from Egypt during the Bronze Age collapse gives us a more nuanced understanding of what survival meant. But they did experience severe stress that caused social breakdown, economic crisis, and political problems that would have long-lasting consequences. Their survival was relative. They maintained continuity when others didn't, but it came at significant cost and left Egypt substantially weakened. The strike at Deir el-Medina, in particular, resonates across 3 millennia as a remarkably modern-seeming event. Workers organizing to demand their wages, refusing to work until paid, forcing the state to negotiate with them. This could be a labor dispute from the Industrial Revolution or the modern era. The fact that it happened in ancient Egypt during a major historical crisis tells us several things. That ordinary people had agency even in highly authoritarian societies, that economic stress creates conditions where people will challenge authority when survival is at stake, and that states depend on maintaining their basic functions, like paying workers, to maintain legitimacy and control. The tomb robberies tell a different but complementary story. When the most sacred prohibitions can't prevent crime, when people with positions of trust and authority participate in looting, when the fear of gods and pharaohs isn't enough to maintain order, that's societal breakdown at a fundamental level. The robberies weren't just theft, they were symbolic violations of everything Egyptian society held sacred. That they happened on such a large scale shows how desperate people had become, and how much the state's capacity to maintain order had eroded. Both the strikes and the robberies appear in the historical record because Egypt maintained enough administrative capacity to document them. Scribes recorded the strike negotiations. Investigators documented the tomb robbery trials. This is actually significant. It means Egypt's bureaucratic system was still functioning even as it was being challenged and violated. Other Bronze Age states during their collapse periods didn't maintain records because they couldn't. Their administrative systems had completely broken down. Egypt's continued documentation of its own problems is paradoxical evidence of both crisis and resilience. The Nile crisis also provides important evidence for understanding the global nature of the Bronze Age collapse. The fact that even regions with supposedly reliable water sources were affected shows that the climate disruption was widespread and connected to large-scale patterns, not just local or regional phenomena. The African monsoon system is driven by different mechanisms than Mediterranean rainfall, but both were affected by changes in global climate patterns. This helps explain why the collapse was so widespread. No region was truly isolated from the climate shifts happening around the world, even if some regions were affected more severely than others. From a human perspective, the Nile crisis must have been psychologically devastating for Egyptians. The river was more than just a water source. It was divine, sacred, the source of life itself. The god Hapi personified the Nile flood and was worshipped throughout Egypt. When the flood was inadequate, it wasn't just an agricultural problem, it was a sign that the gods were displeased, or that the pharaoh was failing in his divine duty to maintain cosmic order, or that the world itself was somehow going wrong. The religious and psychological impact of Nile failure probably cannot be overstated. It would have undermined fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality and Egypt's place in the cosmic order. The response to the Nile crisis, increased prayers and offerings, more elaborate flood-related rituals, anxious monitoring of flood levels, shows Egyptians trying to manage a problem they didn't fully understand. They couldn't know about changes in the African monsoon or global climate patterns. From their perspective, the gods were withholding the flood, and the solution was to appease them through proper religious observance. When that didn't work consistently, it must have created profound uncertainty and fear. Modern science can explain what was happening, but for Bronze Age Egyptians, their entire world was becoming inexplicably unreliable. In the end, the Nile crisis shows that even Egypt, wealthy, powerful, organized, blessed with the ancient world's most reliable water source, was vulnerable to the climate catastrophe that destroyed the Bronze Age world. They survived better than most, but they suffered. The strikes, the robberies, the administrative problems, the social stress. All of this shows a civilization struggling to maintain itself under conditions that challenged every assumption on which it was built. Egypt's story during the Bronze Age collapse isn't one of easy survival. It's one of difficult, painful, costly endurance through a crisis that pushed even the strongest civilization of the age to its limits. And understanding those limits, seeing how close even Egypt came to breaking, helps us appreciate just how devastating the Bronze Age collapse really was. So now we need to circle back to those sea peoples we discussed earlier, because having examined all the evidence about climate crisis, agricultural collapse, and cascading failures, we can finally understand who they really were and what their role was in the Bronze Age collapse. And here's where we get to completely overturn that Victorian interpretation about barbarian invasions destroying civilization. The modern understanding of the Sea Peoples is radically different from what historians believed for most of the 20th century, and it's way more interesting, and frankly more tragic, than the old invasion narrative ever was. The traditional story, remember, was basically ancient world D-Day, organized fleets of warriors from mysterious origins launching coordinated attacks across the eastern Mediterranean, burning cities, destroying kingdoms, and generally acting like Bronze Age Vikings on a rampage. It was dramatic. Barbarians attack, civilization falls, end of story. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. The modern interpretation, based on decades of archaeological work, scientific analysis, and more nuanced reading of ancient texts, is that the Sea Peoples weren't a unified invasion force at all. They were refugees. They were displaced populations fleeing from regions where agricultural systems had collapsed, where droughts had made life unsustainable, where the entire social and economic order was falling apart. They weren't coming to destroy Bronze Age civilization, they were fleeing from its destruction. The difference is crucial, and it completely changes how we understand the collapse. Think about what we've established so far. There was a severe, prolonged drought affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. Agricultural systems were failing. Food was scarce. Trade networks were breaking down. Political systems were destabilizing. People were starving. Now, if you're a farmer in, say, Greece or Western Turkey, and your crops have failed for the third year in a row, and there's no food to buy because your neighbour's crops have also failed, and the palace system that was supposed to provide support has collapsed, and there's violence and chaos spreading, what do? You can't just stay put and starve. You have to move. You have to find somewhere, anywhere, that might have food and stability and a chance for survival. This is what created the Sea Peoples. They weren't warriors setting out to conquer new territories. They were desperate people fleeing catastrophe, taking to ships because that was their only option, moving along coasts and islands looking for places they might settle, or resources they might acquire. Some of these groups were probably organized to some degree, whole communities moving together with whatever leadership structures they had. Some were probably more chaotic, collections of families and individuals who'd banded together for mutual protection. And yes, some of them were willing to use violence when necessary, because when you're starving and you encounter a city with stored grain, moral calculations get complicated pretty quickly. The archaeology supports this interpretation in multiple ways. First, the destructions associated with Sea Peoples aren't uniform or coordinated. Different cities were destroyed at different times over a period of decades. Some cities show evidence of violent destruction with burn layers and bodies left unburied, signs of sudden catastrophe. but other cities show evidence of gradual decline and eventual abandonment with no signs of violence at all. If the Sea Peoples were a coordinated military force, you'd expect to see a more uniform pattern of destruction happening in a shorter time frame. Instead, what we see looks more like a region under chronic stress, with various groups of displaced peoples moving through over an extended period, sometimes clashing with settled populations, sometimes settling peacefully, sometimes just passing through on their way elsewhere. Second, when we look at where Sea Peoples groups eventually settled, and we can track this through pottery styles, burial practices, and other archaeological markers, they often settled peacefully or were integrated into existing communities. The Philistines, who were probably the Peliset mentioned in Egyptian records, settled along the coast of what's now Israel and Gaza. Their settlements show a mixture of Mycenaean-style pottery and local Canaanite styles, suggesting cultural blending rather than simple conquest. They adopted some local practices while maintaining some of their own traditions. This is what you'd expect from refugees settling in new areas, not from conquering warriors imposing their culture by force. Third, the scale of Sea Peoples movements, based on archaeological evidence, wasn't nearly as massive as the Victorian invasion theory implied. We're not talking about armies of tens of thousands sweeping across the Mediterranean. We're talking about smaller groups, maybe hundreds or a few thousand people at a time, moving in waves over decades. That's still significant when you add it all up, but it's not the kind of overwhelming military force that could destroy major empires by itself. It's the scale you'd expect from refugee movements during a regional crisis. The Egyptian inscriptions that describe the Sea Peoples make more sense when read through this new lens. Yes, Ramesses III describes them as enemies who attacked Egypt. But if you read carefully, the inscriptions also describe them as bringing their families, their possessions, their livestock. They're moving en masse, not conducting a military campaign. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show Sea Peoples with ox carts carrying their belongings, women and children among the fighting men. This isn't what an invasion looks like. This is what a migration looks like. These are people who've brought everything they own because they're not planning to go back. They're looking for a new home. The naval battles that Ramesses III fought against the Sea Peoples probably did happen. The Egyptian accounts are likely based on real events, even if exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But understanding the Sea Peoples as refugees changes the context of those battles. Egypt wasn't fighting off a coordinated invasion aimed at conquering Egyptian territory. Egypt was dealing with desperate groups of displaced peoples trying to enter or pass through Egyptian territory, probably looking for food and land, and Egypt was violently preventing them from doing so. It's less D-Day, and more like a border crisis with lethal consequences. Now, this doesn't mean the Sea Peoples were entirely peaceful or blameless. Desperate people do desperate things. When you're fleeing famine and collapse, when your children are hungry, when you've lost everything, you might resort to raiding, pillaging, or violence to survive. Some Sea Peoples groups probably did attack and destroy cities, either to take resources or simply because they were armed refugees who met armed resistance and fighting broke out. But understanding them as primarily refugees rather than conquerors changes the moral framework. It's not evil barbarians destroying civilization for fun. It's desperate people struggling to survive a catastrophe that was destroying everyone's world. The question of where these refugees came from is complex because Sea Peoples was never a single unified group. The Egyptian records list multiple different groups with different names, and they probably came from different places. Some likely came from Greece or the Aegean Islands, fleeing the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. Some probably came from western Turkey or the Anatolian coast, displaced by the fall of the Hittite Empire and the chaos that followed. Some might have come from Syria or the northern Levant, fleeing drought and political breakdown in those regions. Some groups might have been displaced multiple times, forced to move by initial climate problems, then displaced again when they tried to settle somewhere that was also experiencing crisis, creating a domino effect of refugee movements. This brings us to one of the most poignant pieces of archaeological evidence for understanding the end of the Bronze Age, the final days of Megiddo. Remember, we discussed earlier how Megiddo had been Egypt's agricultural production center, deliberately developed and protected as part of Egypt's food security strategy. Well, that strategy eventually failed, and the archaeological evidence from Megiddo's final Bronze Age occupation tells a fascinating and tragic story about what the end looked like for Bronze Age cities. The archaeological layer corresponding to the end of the Bronze Age at Megiddo, what archaeologists call Stratum 7a, shows something remarkable. The city was massively overcrowded. Population density within the walls was far higher than in earlier periods. Houses that had been single-family residences in earlier times show evidence of being subdivided to accommodate multiple families. Storage rooms were converted to living spaces. Every available space within the walls seems to have been utilised for housing. The city was packed with far more people than its infrastructure was designed to support, which tells us that people from the surrounding countryside, and probably from further away, had fled to Megiddo for protection. This makes sense when you think about it. Megiddo had walls, Egyptian protection, and presumably some remaining food stores even as the agricultural system was failing. If you were a farmer whose land had become unproductive, or if you were fleeing violence in other regions, or if you were just desperately seeking safety, Megiddo would have looked like a refuge. The problem, of course, is that cities besieged by refugees from their own collapsing hinterlands can't sustain themselves for long. Those walls that provided protection also trapped the population when food ran out. Here's where the archaeology gets really specific and really grim. The excavations at Megiddo found something unusual in the final occupation layer: ovens built right against the city gates on the inside. These weren't permanent installations, they were hastily constructed makeshift ovens, built in locations that would normally be kept clear for defensive reasons and for traffic flow through the gates. Finding ovens at the gates tells us several things, and none of them are good. First, it suggests extreme crowding. Normal living spaces were so packed that people were using any available space, even inappropriate locations like gate areas, for basic activities like baking bread. Second, it suggests breakdown of normal social organisation. In an organised city, you don't build ovens blocking the gates. Authorities would prevent it because it interferes with defence and movement. The fact that these ovens existed suggests authority had broken down to the point where people were doing whatever they needed to survive, regardless of regulations or defensive requirements. Third, and most ominously, building ovens at the gates might indicate preparation for siege. If you expect your gates to be closed for an extended period, either because enemies are outside or because you're trying to keep desperate refugees out, you need cooking facilities near where guards and defenders will be stationed. The location of these ovens suggests Megiddo knew it was under threat and was making desperate preparations to hold out. The archaeological context provides more clues. The ovens were found in association with the final destruction layer, when Megiddo burned and was abandoned at the end of the Bronze Age. Carbon dating and pottery styles date this destruction to around 1130 BCE, right at the tail end of the collapse period. The destruction was violent and sudden. Walls collapsed, buildings burned, and the site was abandoned. But unlike earlier destructions at the site, which had been followed by rebuilding, this time Megiddo wasn't rebuilt at the same scale for centuries. So what happened in those final days? We can reconstruct a scenario based on the archaeological evidence, though we'll never know the exact details. Megiddo, the city was overcrowded, food was scarce, and desperate preparations were being made for siege or for keeping refugees out. Then something happened. Maybe an attack by one of the Sea Peoples groups moving through the area, maybe internal collapse, maybe some combination of factors, and the city fell. It burned, people died or fled, and the site was abandoned. The makeshift ovens at the gates are like a snapshot frozen in time, the last desperate attempts of a Bronze Age city to survive when everything was falling apart. Someone built those ovens thinking they would help the city hold out. Instead, they became archaeological evidence of the end of a civilization. There's something profoundly sad about that. People trying to adapt, trying to survive, making practical decisions about where to build ovens, and none of it mattering because the entire system they were part of was dying. Megiddo wasn't unique in this pattern. Other Canaanite cities show similar evidence of overcrowding, hasty fortifications, and eventually violent destruction or abandonment around the same period. Lachish, another major city, was destroyed around 1150 BCE. Hazor was destroyed even earlier, around 1200 BCE. Giza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, city after city shows the same pattern of late Bronze Age destruction, followed by either abandonment or much reduced Iron Age occupation. The entire urban system of Canaan was collapsing, and Megiddo's story was being repeated across the region. The Sea Peoples were part of this collapse, but as symptoms rather than causes. They were groups of people fleeing from collapsing regions, moving through areas that were themselves collapsing, sometimes attacking cities that were already failing, sometimes settling in the ruins, sometimes just passing through on their way to somewhere that might offer better prospects. The Egyptian records focus on the groups that attacked Egypt or tried to enter Egyptian territory, because those were the ones Egypt cared about. But there were probably many more groups of displaced peoples moving through the region, fighting with each other as much as with settled populations, struggling to survive in a world where the old order was disintegrating. Understanding the sea peoples this way helps explain some puzzles that the invasion theory never addressed adequately. For instance, why don't we have clear evidence of where the sea peoples came from? Because they came from multiple different places that were themselves experiencing collapse, so there's no single homeland to identify. Why did some sea peoples groups settle peacefully while others were violent? Because these weren't coordinated military forces with unified strategies. They were diverse groups of refugees making different choices based on their specific circumstances. Why did the invasions stretch out over decades rather than happening all at once? Because these were waves of migration driven by ongoing crisis, not a coordinated military campaign with a specific timeline. The modern interpretation also explains why Bronze Age civilizations had so much trouble dealing with the sea peoples. If they'd been conventional military threats, the great empires should have been able to defeat them. Bronze Age kingdoms had sophisticated militaries and plenty of experience fighting wars. But you can't defeat refugee crises with military force alone, especially when your own civilization is collapsing and you lack the resources to maintain armies or control territory effectively. Egypt did defeat sea peoples militarily, at least according to their records, but that didn't solve the underlying problem. More displaced peoples kept coming because the crisis causing the displacement kept continuing. They developed Megiddo as a food production center to support their own food security. So Egypt's strategic agricultural site was destroyed by people who were, in a sense, victims of the same climate catastrophe that Egypt was trying to protect itself against. Egypt couldn't protect Megiddo because they were stretched too thin dealing with their own problems and the broader regional crisis. The archaeological evidence from other sites in the eastern Mediterranean shows similar patterns to Megiddo. Ugarit, the cosmopolitan port city we discussed earlier, shows signs of hasty fortification efforts before its final destruction around 1190 BCE. The last texts from Ugarit include letters desperately requesting military aid from neighbours, requests that apparently went unanswered because everyone was dealing with their own crises. The city's destruction was violent and total. It burned, was abandoned, and was never reoccupied at anything like its former scale. The sophisticated Bronze Age port became ruins buried under sand, only rediscovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. Troy Sevener, the city that might have been besieged in the legendary Trojan War, was destroyed around 1180 BCE. Whether this destruction was related to sea peoples' movements or other factors is debated, but the timing fits the broader pattern of Bronze Age collapse. Some show evidence of attempts to strengthen fortifications before the end, suggesting they knew trouble was coming but couldn't prevent it. After their destruction, Greece entered a dark age that lasted for centuries. What's particularly striking about these destructions is that many of them weren't rebuilt, or were rebuilt at much smaller scale. This indicates population loss that went beyond just the immediate casualties of whatever destroyed each city. People died, yes, but also people fled. People were displaced, people became refugees themselves, continuing the cycle. That's the kind of population loss you see from combinations of famine, disease, violence, and mass migration all happening simultaneously. The sea peoples in this context were both perpetrators and victims of this demographic catastrophe. They were fleeing population collapse in their home regions, contributing to population loss in regions they moved through, and sometimes settling in depopulated areas left empty by earlier collapses. It was a churning, chaotic process that mixed populations and cultures, while simultaneously destroying the complex social organizations that had characterized the Bronze Age world. Some positive outcomes did eventually emerge from this chaos, though calling them positive feels wrong given the suffering involved. The Philistines, settling in the southern Levant, brought ironworking technology with them, or developed it after settlement. Archaeological evidence shows early iron use in Philistine sites. This contributed to the broader transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The population mixing created new cultural syntheses that would influence later developments. The collapse of the palace systems allowed different forms of social organization to emerge. But these long-term developments came at enormous immediate human cost. The modern reinterpretation of the sea peoples has been gradual, developed over decades as evidence accumulated and scholars moved beyond the Victorian invasion framework. Some historians in the mid-20th century started questioning the invasion theory, but it wasn't until the 1990s and 2000s that the refugee interpretation really gained traction, driven by several factors. Better archaeological methods showed the complexity and variability of destructions. Scientific evidence revealed the climate crisis that made mass migration necessary. Comparative studies of other historical refugee crises provided frameworks for understanding ancient population movements. And perhaps most importantly, scholars started reading Egyptian sources more critically, recognizing that Ramesses III's propaganda wasn't necessarily accurate historical description. There's still debate about specific details, exactly which Sea Peoples groups came from where, what percentage of destructions were violent versus peaceful abandonment, how much agency different groups had in their movements and actions. But the broad scholarly consensus has shifted decisively away from the invasion theory toward understanding the Sea Peoples as refugees and symptoms of collapse rather than its primary cause. This shift represents a more sophisticated understanding of how complex societies fail, not usually from external invasion alone, but from combinations of environmental stress, economic problems, social breakdown, and the secondary effects of all of these factors interacting. The story of Megiddo's final days encapsulates this complexity perfectly. Here was a city that had been prosperous and strategically important, deliberately developed by Egypt as an agricultural center, fortified and protected. But the city became overcrowded with refugees, food supplies dwindled, desperate measures like the gate ovens were implemented, and eventually it all failed. The archaeological evidence doesn't tell us whether Megiddo fell to Sea Peoples' attack, internal collapse, or some other specific cause, and in some sense, it doesn't matter, because all of these were symptoms of the same underlying catastrophe. What the archaeological evidence does tell us is that people tried. They tried to adapt, to fortify, to survive. Those makeshift ovens represent human agency in the face of civilizational collapse, people making practical decisions, trying to continue basic activities like baking bread even as their world fell apart. This is important to remember. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just abstract historical forces and large-scale processes. It was composed of millions of individual human decisions and experiences, most of which left no trace in the archaeological record. The ovens survived because they were made of stone and clay. The hopes, fears, desperation, and determination of the people who built them survived only as shadows in the archaeological context. The reinterpretation of the Sea Peoples changes our understanding not just of the Bronze Age collapse, but of how civilizations fail more generally. Collapse isn't usually a simple story of strong invaders defeating weak defenders. It's usually a complex story of systems under stress, cascading failures, populations in motion, violence and suffering mixed with attempts at adaptation and survival. The Sea Peoples weren't history's villains. They were history's refugees, trying to survive a catastrophe that was destroying everyone's world. That some of them resorted to violence, that their movements contributed to further destruction, that they became actors in the collapse story. All of this is true but doesn't make them the primary cause. The primary cause was environmental catastrophe interacting with the vulnerabilities of an interconnected civilization that couldn't adapt quickly enough. And this brings us to perhaps the most important lesson from understanding the Sea Peoples correctly, recognizing that the victims of collapse can also become agents of further collapse. The people fleeing from destroyed regions weren't trying to destroy other regions, they were trying to survive. But their survival efforts, perfectly understandable from their perspective, created additional stress on systems that were already failing. This dynamic, where victims of crisis create new crises in turn, is recognizable in many historical and contemporary situations. It's not about assigning blame, it's about understanding how systemic failures cascade through populations and across regions in ways that create self-reinforcing cycles of disruption. The Bronze Age collapse, understood this way, becomes less a story about barbarians destroying civilization and more a story about civilization destroying itself through a combination of environmental stress, systemic vulnerabilities, and cascading failures that turned everyone into either victims or desperate actors, or usually both. The Sea Peoples were the human face of that collapse, the visible symptom of underlying catastrophe, the refugees and raiders who appear in historical records because they moved and fought and died in ways that left archaeological traces. But behind them were millions of others who died more quietly, who fled and left no trace, who suffered and adapted and survived or didn't in ways we'll never fully know. The collapse was their story too, and understanding the Sea Peoples as refugees helps us remember that every historical catastrophe is ultimately composed of individual human tragedies, multiplied 1,000,000 times over. So we've travelled through one of history's greatest catastrophes, From the prosperous interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age to its dramatic collapse around 1200 BCE, we've seen how climate change triggered agricultural failure, how economic systems cascaded into chaos, how even mighty Egypt struggled to survive, and how populations were displaced in waves of desperate migration. Now we need to talk about what all of this means, not just for understanding ancient history, but for understanding our own world and its vulnerabilities. Because the uncomfortable truth is that the Bronze Age collapse has some deeply unsettling parallels to challenges we're facing right now, and the lessons from 200 years ago are still relevant, perhaps more relevant than we'd like to admit. Let's start with the most obvious parallel: climate change. These weren't dramatic changes by geological standards. We're talking about temperature shifts of a degree or two Celsius, rainfall reductions of maybe 20 to 30%, sea surface temperature changes that seem minor when measured in tenths of degrees. But these small changes, sustained over decades, were enough to destroy multiple civilizations that had flourished for centuries. Bronze Age people didn't cause their climate crisis. It was driven by natural variations in ocean currents, atmospheric circulation patterns, and solar cycles. But the result was catastrophic regardless of the cause. Today, we're facing climate change that is being caused by human activity, primarily greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels. The scale of change we're experiencing is actually larger and faster than what happened during the Bronze Age collapse. Global average temperatures have already increased by more than 1 degree Celsius since the late 1800s, and we're on track for considerably more warming this century unless emissions are dramatically reduced. Sea levels are rising. Weather patterns are shifting. Drought is affecting some regions while others experience increased flooding. The agricultural systems that feed our current global population of 8 billion people were developed under the climate conditions of the past few centuries, and those conditions are changing in ways that will stress those systems. Now here's where people often get the Bronze Age comparison wrong. We're not going to experience an identical collapse to what happened in 1200 BCE. Our world is vastly different in technology, knowledge, and organization. We understand what's causing climate change, which the Bronze Age people didn't. We have scientific capability to predict and potentially adapt to changes. We have global communication and coordination capacity that didn't exist in the ancient world. Our agricultural technology is far more sophisticated, with irrigation systems, fertilizers, multiple crop varieties, and global trade in food that can compensate for regional shortfalls. We're not helpless before climate change the way Bronze Age civilizations were. But the Bronze Age collapse showed what happens when interconnected systems fail. Problems in one area rapidly cascade to other areas, trade networks break down, specialized economic systems collapse, and societies that seemed prosperous and stable can disintegrate within a few decades. Our modern global economy is interconnected in ways that make Bronze Age trade networks look simple by comparison. Consider what happened when a single container ship blocked the Suez Canal for less than a week in 2021. Global trade was disrupted, supply chains backed up, shortages emerged for various goods. Or look at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic when supply chains were stressed. Suddenly there were shortages of everything from computer chips to toilet paper, not because these things couldn't be produced, but because the complex logistics systems that delivered them to where they were needed got disrupted. These are small previews of what systemic failures in interconnected global systems look like. The Bronze Age collapse was a much larger and longer version of these disruptions, and it shows that sophisticated, interconnected civilizations can be more vulnerable than they appear precisely because everything depends on everything else continuing to function. The climate mechanism that destroyed the Bronze Age, small changes in sea surface temperatures affecting rainfall patterns, is particularly relevant today. Modern climate science shows that relatively small changes in ocean temperatures can have dramatic effects on weather patterns, including the monsoon systems that billions of people depend on for agriculture. The Indian monsoon, which waters crops for nearly 2 billion people in South Asia, is driven by ocean temperature patterns that are being affected by climate change. The African monsoon is shifting. The El Niño Southern Oscillation, which affects weather patterns globally, is being influenced by warming oceans. We're essentially running an uncontrolled experiment in how much we can change ocean temperatures before critical weather patterns shift in ways that seriously affect agriculture. Modern agriculture is calibrated to current climate conditions, crop varieties, planting schedules, irrigation systems, pest management strategies, all assume certain temperature ranges, rainfall patterns, and growing season lengths. Climate change is shifting all of these variables simultaneously. Some regions might benefit from longer growing seasons or increased rainfall, at least initially. But we also face the population displacement issue that the Bronze Age experienced with the Sea Peoples, except potentially at much larger scale. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean had a population of maybe a few million people spread across multiple kingdoms. When agricultural systems failed and populations were displaced, we're talking about movements of thousands or tens of thousands of people, enough to seriously destabilize regions but manageable in absolute numbers. Today, we have major agricultural regions with populations in the tens or hundreds of millions who depend on climate conditions that are changing. If regions become unsuitable for supporting their current populations, whether due to drought, sea level rise, extreme heat, or other climate effects, where do those people go? Modern nation-states have borders, immigration policies, and considerably less tolerance for mass migration than Bronze Age kingdoms had. Not that Bronze Age kingdoms were particularly welcoming to refugees, but they lacked the bureaucratic capacity to fully control borders the way modern states do. The Syrian refugee crisis that began in 2011, triggered partly by a severe drought that contributed to social instability and civil war, displaced millions of people and created serious political tensions in Europe and the Middle East. That's with a relatively small fraction of global population displaced. Scale that up to what could happen if climate change seriously affects agriculture in regions like India, Bangladesh, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Central America, and you get scenarios that make the Bronze Age Sea Peoples' migrations look quaint by comparison. The Bronze Age collapse also teaches us about how political systems respond to environmental stress. Bronze Age kingdoms tried to adapt. Egypt developed Megiddo as an agricultural backup. Hittite records show attempts to import grain when domestic supplies failed. Various kingdoms strengthened fortifications and militaries. These adaptations weren't enough because the underlying problems were too severe and too widespread. Today, we're seeing similar patterns of attempted adaptation. Some countries are investing in agricultural technology, water management and renewable energy. Others are strengthening borders and militaries. The question is whether these adaptations will be sufficient, or whether we're just rearranging the deck chairs on a much larger, slower-moving Titanic. One significant difference between the Bronze Age collapse and today is that we have much better understanding of what's happening and why. Bronze Age people didn't understand climate science. They interpreted environmental problems through religious frameworks, assuming that droughts meant the gods were displeased or that proper rituals would restore normal conditions. This led to responses that couldn't address the actual problems. We understand that climate change is driven by greenhouse gas emissions, which means we theoretically know what needs to be done: reduce emissions, transition to renewable energy, adapt agricultural systems, improve water management, and so on. The challenge isn't knowledge, it's collective action at a global scale, which is extraordinarily difficult to coordinate given competing national interests, economic concerns, and political realities. The Bronze Age collapse also illustrates how quickly complex civilizations can fail once cascading failures begin. The Late Bronze Age was at its peak around 1250 BCE. Trade flourishing, kingdoms powerful, cities prosperous. By 1150 BCE, just 100 years later, within the span of a single long human lifetime, most of those civilizations were gone or severely diminished. That's historically very rapid collapse. It shows that having centuries of successful civilization doesn't make you immune to failure when environmental and systemic stresses combine in the wrong ways. This should be sobering for modern civilization, which tends to assume that because we've been successful for the past few centuries of industrialization, we'll continue being successful indefinitely. There's also the question of inequality and how it affects resilience during crises. Bronze Age societies were highly unequal. Elites lived in luxury while peasants lived subsistence existences. But eventually the systems broke down and the inequality became unsustainable. You can't maintain elite luxury when the agricultural base that supports it has collapsed. Modern societies are also highly unequal, and there's evidence that this inequality reduces resilience during crises. When substantial portions of the population are already economically stressed during normal times, they have no buffer for dealing with additional shocks. And the Bronze Age Dark Age that followed the collapse is also instructive. This lasted for centuries in places like Greece, where the collapse of Mycenaean civilization led to a Dark Age that lasted until about 800 BCE, when Greek civilization began recovering and eventually flourished in the classical period. That's 300 to 400 years of reduced population, simpler technology, and lost knowledge. But calling it a dark age is somewhat misleading. Yes, it was a dark age compared to the sophistication of late Bronze Age civilization, but it wasn't entirely negative. The collapse cleared away the palace systems that had been failing, allowing new forms of social organization to develop. The population decline reduced pressure on environmental resources, giving ecosystems time to recover. The alphabetic writing systems that came out of this period, including the ancestor of the alphabet you're reading right now, were actually simpler and more accessible than the complex Bronze Age writing systems like Linear B or Hittite cuneiform. In some ways, the Dark Age was a necessary reset that cleared the way for new civilizations to emerge. This offers some hope actually, though perhaps cold comfort. Even if we face serious climate-driven disruptions to our current systems, humanity will adapt and continue. We're remarkably resilient as a species, and even catastrophic collapses don't eliminate us. They just force dramatic reorganizations that are really unpleasant for everyone living through them. The Bronze Age, Dark Age killed millions, destroyed civilizations, and eliminated accumulated knowledge, but humanity survived and eventually built something new. If worst-case climate scenarios happen, we'll probably survive and eventually rebuild too. The question is how much suffering and loss we're willing to accept, because the species survives and rebuilds eventually is not exactly a comforting strategy for the billions of people who'd lived through the collapse and rebuilding period. There's also the technology question. Bronze Age, they couldn't develop drought-resistant crops in a few decades, couldn't build massive irrigation systems to compensate for rainfall loss, couldn't transition to different agricultural systems quickly enough to matter. We have capabilities they lacked: genetic engineering of crops, large-scale water management, renewable energy, carbon capture technology, and so on. Whether we'll deploy these capabilities effectively and at sufficient scale is uncertain, but we at least have options Bronze Age civilizations didn't. Some people argue that the Bronze Age collapse comparison is alarmist, that we're much more capable than ancient civilizations and won't experience anything like their catastrophe. Maybe they're right, but it's worth noting that people in the late Bronze Age probably thought they were pretty sophisticated too. They seemed stable and successful right up until they weren't. The collapse, when it came, surprised them. The texts we have from the period don't show awareness that they were living through the end of an entire civilizational era. They thought they were dealing with temporary problems that would eventually be resolved. Instead, they were experiencing the beginning of centuries of Dark Age. The question of whether climate-driven collapse is avoidable depends partly on how much warming occurs and how quickly. Modern climate change is happening even faster in some respects, which might actually help because the urgency is more obvious. But it's also more severe, and we're adding climate stress to an already stressed global system dealing with resource depletion, biodiversity loss, population pressures, and various political and economic challenges. Multiple stresses hitting simultaneously was what created the Bronze Age perfect storm, and we're arguably creating our own perfect storm now. One thing the Bronze Age collapse makes clear is that you can't wait until you're in full crisis mode to start adapting. By the time Bronze Age kingdoms recognized how serious their problems were, it was too late to implement effective solutions. The climate had already shifted, agriculture had already failed, trade networks had already broken down, populations were already displaced. Any adaptation measures needed years to decades to implement, but the crisis was already overwhelming them. This suggests that waiting until climate effects are undeniable and severe before taking action is a recipe for failure. Adaptation needs to happen preemptively, when you still have the resources and organizational capacity to implement it, not after systems are already failing. The Bronze Age collapse also demonstrates that local adaptation isn't sufficient during global crises. Egypt adapted better than most civilizations. They developed Megiddo, they maintained their administrative systems, they successfully fought off the Sea Peoples militarily. But they still suffered severe stress because they couldn't isolate themselves from the broader regional collapse. Modern climate change is global by definition, which means even countries that adapt well domestically will face challenges from disruptions elsewhere. Climate refugees, supply chain failures, conflict in affected regions, these will affect everyone, even well-prepared nations. These civilizations fell partly because of natural climate variability they didn't cause and couldn't control. We're facing climate change that we did cause and could theoretically control, but we're struggling to implement the changes needed to prevent serious problems. The Bronze Age people would probably have fixed their climate crisis if they'd had the knowledge and technology to do so. They had no moral qualms about interventionist solutions. They just lacked the capability. We have the capability but struggle with the collective action problems, economic concerns, and political challenges involved in actually using it. History might judge us more harshly than Bronze Age civilizations because we knew better and had options they didn't, yet still failed to act sufficiently. The resilience factors that helped Egypt survive the Bronze Age collapse are also instructive. Egypt had the Nile, which provided more reliable water than rain-fed agriculture. Egypt had a sophisticated administrative system that could organize complex responses like the Megiddo Agricultural Project. Egypt had centuries of institutional experience dealing with floods and droughts. Egypt had enough resources to maintain military capability when others couldn't. These factors didn't prevent Egypt from suffering or from eventually declining, but they did help Egypt survive when others didn't. For modern nations, building resilience means having diverse resources, strong institutions, adaptive capacity, and buffers against shocks. Basically, not putting all your eggs in one basket and maintaining redundancy in critical systems. The interconnection vulnerability is particularly relevant today. Bronze Age trade networks connected distant regions, creating efficient systems for moving copper, tin, and other goods. But that efficiency became a vulnerability when problems in one area cascaded through the network. Modern global supply chains are orders of magnitude more interconnected than Bronze Age trade networks, which makes them more efficient but potentially more vulnerable. The just-in-time manufacturing philosophy that minimizes storage and transportation cost also minimizes buffers against disruption. When COVID-19 hit, we discovered how dependent we are on specific manufacturing centers for critical goods. Climate change could create similar or worse disruptions if agricultural regions fail or if extreme weather repeatedly damages infrastructure. There's also the question of how collapse actually proceeds. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't uniform. It hit different regions at different times with varying severity. Some places experienced violent destruction, others gradual decline and abandonment. Some populations were displaced while others adapted in place. Modern climate change is also likely to affect different regions differently and at different times. Some areas might actually benefit initially from longer growing seasons or increased rainfall. Others will suffer from droughts, sea level rise, extreme heat, or increased storms. The result could be a patchwork of regional crises rather than a single global catastrophe, which creates its own challenges for response and coordination. The refugee issue deserves more attention because it's likely to be one of the most serious consequences of climate change. The Bronze Age Sea Peoples movements involved populations in the thousands or tens of thousands. The Bronze Age experience shows that desperate, displaced populations can become destabilizing forces even when they're victims of circumstances beyond their control. Managing climate migration humanely while maintaining social stability will be one of the great challenges of the coming decades. Education and knowledge preservation are also relevant lessons. The Bronze Age collapse led to loss of writing systems and accumulated knowledge in many regions. If disruptions affected education systems or caused brain drain from affected regions, we could experience selective knowledge loss even if we don't lose the actual information. Maintaining educational institutions and scientific capacity during times of stress is crucial for long-term resilience. The psychological and social aspects of collapse also matter. Bronze Age people experienced their world falling apart without understanding why or how to fix it. The psychological toll of watching your civilization disintegrate, of seeing assumptions about how the world works proven wrong, of suffering through extended crisis without clear hope for improvement, this must have been profound. We might face similar challenges as climate change effects become more severe, and as people realize that the stable climate and environment we've enjoyed for millennia isn't guaranteed. Maintaining social cohesion, mental health, and hope during extended crisis is important for resilience and for implementing effective responses. One could argue that by studying the Bronze Age collapse, we're better prepared to avoid or mitigate our own potential collapse. We can see the warning signs, understand the mechanisms, recognize the vulnerabilities. That's the optimistic interpretation, that historical knowledge gives us the wisdom to make better choices. The Bronze Age people couldn't have studied previous collapses to learn from them because they didn't have historical records going back far enough. We have new civilizations emerged, new technologies developed, new forms of social organization appeared. Classical Greece, one of the most influential civilizations in history, emerged from the ruins of Mycenaean collapse. The Phoenicians, who invented the alphabet we still use, emerged during the post-collapse period. The Hebrew Bible, one of the most influential texts in history, describes events from this era. But that's cold comfort for people living through the collapse itself, and civilization eventually recovers over centuries isn't much consolation when you're dealing with immediate suffering and disruption. There's also the question of what we'd lose in a major civilizational disruption. Bronze Age, what would we lose? Certainly some technological capacity would be affected if supply chains collapsed and we couldn't maintain current production levels. Specialized knowledge might be lost if experts couldn't maintain their fields or train successors. Cultural heritage could be damaged. Biodiversity that's already under threat would suffer further. The accumulated scientific knowledge of centuries could be partially lost if institutions failed. Not all of this would disappear completely. We have much better information preservation than Bronze Age civilizations, but disruption could still cause significant losses. The Bronze Age collapse timeline is also worth considering. The crisis period lasted roughly from 1200 to 1150 BCE, about 50 years of acute collapse, followed by centuries of dark age before recovery began. Modern climate change operates on similar or longer timescales. We're already experiencing effects, and they're projected to worsen over the rest of this century and beyond. That's multiple human generations dealing with increasing stress and disruption. The social and political challenges of maintaining civilization through extended crisis are enormous. Short-term thinking and political cycles measured in years struggle with problems that unfold over decades to centuries. Some technological optimists argue that we'll innovate our way out of climate problems, new energy sources, carbon capture, geoengineering, agricultural innovations. Maybe they're right. Humans are remarkably inventive when motivated, but the Bronze Age collapse shows that sophisticated civilizations with impressive capabilities can still fail when environmental and systemic stresses combine in particularly damaging ways. Having smart people and good technology doesn't guarantee survival if the problems are severe enough and the responses aren't implemented quickly enough. Innovation is necessary but not sufficient for avoiding serious climate disruptions. The role of leadership and governance is also relevant. This should have been an advantage for rapid response to crisis, but it didn't save them. Modern democracies have to build political consensus for major policy changes, which is slower but potentially more sustainable when people buy into the changes. Autocratic systems might respond more quickly, but might also make poor decisions without sufficient input or accountability. The Bronze Age collapse doesn't clearly vindicate either governance system, but it does show that governance matters and that poor decisions during crisis can accelerate collapse while good decisions can build resilience. The question of equity and justice in climate response is also crucial and relates to Bronze Age patterns. The Bronze Age elite initially tried to maintain their privileges by extracting more from the lower classes, but this eventually backfired as social systems broke down. Modern climate justice isn't just a moral issue, it's a practical issue for maintaining social stability during stress. Societies that address climate challenges more equitably will probably handle the transitions better than societies with high inequality. Looking at all this evidence from the Bronze Age collapse, what can we conclude about our own situation? First, that climate change is serious and can have civilizational-level effects even when the changes seem modest by geological standards. Second, that interconnected systems are efficient but vulnerable to cascading failures. Third, that adaptation needs to happen proactively rather than waiting until crisis is obvious. Fourth, that displaced populations become destabilizing forces even when they're victims. Fifth, that sophisticated civilizations are not immune to collapse when environmental and systemic stresses combine. Sixth, that recovery from major collapse takes centuries and involves enormous suffering. But also this, that humans are resilient, adaptive, and capable of building new civilizations from the ruins of old ones. That knowledge and technology give us capabilities that Bronze Age civilizations lacked. That understanding what's happening and why gives us advantages they didn't have. That we still have time to implement changes that could prevent the worst outcomes, even if we've already committed to some level of disruption. The Bronze Age collapse happened 200 years ago, but it still has things to teach us about vulnerability, resilience, adaptation, and the fragility of complex civilizations. Whether we'll learn those lessons and apply them effectively to our own challenges remains to be seen. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, and the rhyme scheme between the Bronze Age collapse and our current moment is uncomfortably clear. The question is whether we'll write a different ending to this version of the story, or whether future historians, if there are any, will study our collapse the way we study the Bronze Age, wondering how such a sophisticated civilization could fail when warning signs were so obvious. So that's the story of the Bronze Age collapse, how climate change destroyed multiple civilizations simultaneously, how interconnected systems cascaded into failure, how populations were displaced and kingdoms fell, and how the ancient world was transformed in ways that resonated for centuries. It's a story about human vulnerability to environmental forces, about the fragility of complex systems, about suffering and adaptation and eventual renewal. It's a story that happened more than 3 millennia ago, but it echoes into our present and our future in ways that should make us pause and reflect. Whether the Bronze Age people couldn't prevent their collapse because they lacked the knowledge and tools to address climate change. We have both knowledge and tools. Whether we'll use them wisely, whether we'll make the hard choices needed to avoid the worst outcomes, whether we'll build resilience into our systems while we still can, these questions will define our generation and shape the world our descendants inherit. And on that somewhat heavy note, I hope you found this journey through the Bronze Age collapse fascinating, educational, and maybe even a little bit hopeful, despite the darkness of the subject matter. History isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding how and why it happened and what we can learn from it. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that civilizations are fragile, that climate matters, that choices have consequences, and that humanity endures even through the darkest times. So wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is for you, thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's greatest catastrophes. May your night be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your tomorrow be brighter than the Bronze Age dark ages. Sleep well, take care of yourselves, and remember, we're still here, still building, still learning from the past as we face our future. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams.